The cart appeared first as a sound rather than a sight. A low grinding of iron rims against the packed stones of the ridge road where it crested the hill beyond the Easter pasture. You had been listening for it all morning without admitting that you were listening for it, your hands occupied with the folding of linens that had already been folded twice and the sweeping of a floor that held no dust. The sound grew in slow increments, not with the urgency of arrival, but with the patience of something that had been traveling for a very long time and saw no reason to hurry now that the destination was near. You went to the window and looked out across the yard toward the gate where the wooden latch hung slightly askew, as it had for 3 winters, because there was never a moment that seemed right for fixing it. The maples along the fence line had turned the color of rust and old leather, their leaves hanging limp in the still air of mid-afternoon. Some of them had already fallen and lay in a dry brown carpet across the wheel ruts that cut through the grass from the main road. The light was the particular grey that comes in late autumn when the sun stays low and thin behind a scrim of cloud that never quite breaks open into rain, but never clears either. A light that makes everything look like a faded daguerreotype, even while you are standing inside it. You turned from the window and walked the length of the keeping room to the small corner bedchamber that had once been a pantry for storing root vegetables and sacks of meal. The room had been emptied of its shelves 3 weeks ago when the letter arrived, the one written in a stranger's careful script that said he was coming home and would need a place to rest near the ground floor because stairs were a difficulty now. You had swept the plank floor on your hands and knees with a bristle brush until the wood was pale and smooth, and then you had laid down a braided rug made from strips of old woolen clothing cut into long even ribbons and wound tight around a core of twine. The rug was grey and brown and a faded indigo blue that had once been part of your best Sunday dress before the waist tall beyond mending. In the corner stood a rope bed that your own father had built before you were born, its headboard plain maple with a dark knot in the wood that looked like a closed eye. You had aired the straw tick mattress in the yard for 2 full days, turning it once in the morning and once in the afternoon so the sun could reach every part of it, and then you had beaten it with a flat wooden paddle until no dust rose from the ticking when you struck it. Over the mattress you had spread a quilt made of small cotton squares, each one stitched to its neighbor with a line of tiny running stitches that ran straight and even because you had learned to sew by lamplight. And your fingers you had learned to sew by lamplight, and your fingers knew the rhythm without your eyes needing to watch them. The quilt was not new. It had been on the bed in the spare room upstairs for as long as you could remember, and its colors had softened to the same quiet palette as the November sky. Beside the bed you had placed a small table made of cherry wood, with one drawer that stuck, unless you lifted the front edge slightly as you pulled. On the table you set a tin candlestick with a fresh tallow candle already trimmed and ready for the first evening, and next to it a brown earthenware cup that held no chips along its rim. The chair by the window was a simple ladder, back with a woven seat of split hickory bark that had grown dark and shiny from years of use, and you had positioned it so that whoever sat in it would face the glass and see the barn wall and the well sweep and the long strip of field where the grass had been left uncut because there was no one to swing the scythe this year. The sound of the cart grew louder and closer until it was no longer a distant grinding, but a distinct rattle of loose boards and the heavy breathing of a draft horse that had been pulling uphill for the last quarter mile. You smoothed the front of your apron with both hands and walked to the door and opened it and stood on the stone step that was worn into a shallow depression where generations of feet had landed in the same spot. The air was cool and smelled of dry leaves and wood smoke from your own chimney, and something else underneath. The faint mineral scent of the creek that ran low and slow at the bottom of the south field. The cart came into view where the road curved around the stand of bare birch trees, their white bark peeling in thin horizontal strips that fluttered in the breeze like paper hung out to dry. It was a simple farm cart with high sides made of unpainted pine that had weathered to a silvery grey, and it was pulled by a single horse of no particular breed, a sturdy brown animal with a white star on its forehead and mud-dried encrusted rings around its fetlocks. The driver sat on a plank seat with the reins held loosely in one hand while the other rested on his knee, and his posture suggested that he had been sitting in that exact position for many miles and many hours and would continue to sit that way even after the cart stopped moving. Beside the driver, or rather slightly behind him, where the cart bed offered a little shelter from the wind, A man sat with his back against a rolled blanket and his legs stretched out in front of him on the boards. You could not see his face clearly at first because the brim of a slouch hat was pulled low over his eyes and his chin was tucked into the collar of a coat that looked too large for his frame. The coat was federal blue, but so stained and faded that it had become a color that was neither blue nor gray nor brown, but something in between all three. The color of a thing that had been left out in too many seasons of weather. The cart stopped at the gate, and for a long moment nothing moved except the horse's ears, which swiveled back toward the driver, and then forward toward the house, and then back again. The driver did not climb down immediately. He sat looking at the gate latch as if assessing the effort required to lean over and lift it, and then he looked at the house and saw you standing in the doorway, and gave a small nod that was more a lowering of the chin than a movement of the head. Then he climbed down with the slow, deliberate care of a man whose knees had grown stiff from the jolting of the road, and he walked around to the back of the cart and lowered the tailboard with a creak of dry hinges. The man in the blue coat stirred and raised his head, and the hat brim lifted enough for you to see his face, which was thinner than you remembered and older by more than the 4 years that had passed. His cheekbones stood out sharply under skin that had been tanned dark by sun, but now looked pale and tight across the bones, and there were deep lines running from the corners of his mouth down toward his jaw that had not been there when he left. His eyes were the same color they had always been, a light gray like the underside of a rain cloud, but they moved more slowly now as they traveled from the gate to the porch to your face, taking in each detail with a careful, measured attention. He did not smile, and he did not speak. He shifted his weight and began the process of rising from the cart bed, a process that took longer than it should have because he had to brace himself with one arm while the other side of his body offered no assistance. The left sleeve of the blue coat was pinned up neatly just below the shoulder with a row of small brass safety pins, and the fabric hung empty and flat against his side, where an arm should have filled it. He got his good leg under him and pushed up and stood swaying for a moment while the driver reached out a hand, but did not touch him, letting him find his balance on his own. The driver walked to the gate and lifted the latch and swung it inward, and the horse walked through without being told, pulling the cart into the yard and stopping at the exact spot where the grass was worn thin from years of wagons turning around. The driver helped the man down from the cart bed with a series of small steadying movements, a hand under the elbow here and a shoulder to lean against there. And when the man's boots touched the ground, he stood still for a long moment, looking at the grass under his feet, as if surprised to find it solid. He took one step and then stopped again at the base of the porch steps. There were only 3 steps made of flat fieldstone set into the earth, but he looked at them the way a man might look at a steep hillside that needed to be climbed before nightfall. His right hand reached out and found the wooden railing that your father had nailed to the house the week the letter came, and his fingers closed around it and tested its strength with a small tug. Satisfied, he pulled himself up 1 step and paused and breathed, and then pulled himself up the 2nd step and paused again. And on the 3rd step he did not pause but continued forward until he was standing on the porch boards directly in front of you. Up close you could see that his collar was frayed and the top button of his shirt was missing, and there was a small scar just above his right eyebrow that had healed into a white line no longer than your thumbnail. He smelled of wood smoke and horse, and the faint sourness of clothing worn too long without washing, and underneath all of that, the familiar smell of his skin which had not changed at all. He looked at your face the way he had looked at the gate and the porch steps and the grass, taking in each part separately as if assembling a picture from pieces, and then he said in a voice that was rougher and quieter than you remembered, "I made it back." You nodded because your throat had closed around any words you might have said, and you stepped aside so he could pass through the doorway into the keeping room. He walked with the cane that the driver had handed him, a plain length of hickory with a curved handle and a brass ferrule at the tip, and the sound it made on the floorboards was a steady tap and drag that established a new rhythm in the house, slower than any rhythm that had been there before. He crossed to the hearth and stood with his back to the low fire that had been burning since early morning, and the warmth seemed to loosen something in his shoulders because they dropped a fraction of an inch, and his grip on the cane relaxed. You went back outside to speak with the driver, who was already climbing onto his seat and gathering the reins. He told you in a low voice that the journey had been slow, and that the man had slept a great deal and eaten very little, and that he had not spoken more than 10 words in the 3 days they had been on the road. The driver accepted a cup of cold water from the well and drank it in one long swallow, and handed the cup back and said that he would be moving on before the light failed. He did not ask for payment, and you did not offer any, because the letter had said that the army would see to the transport. When you went back inside, the man had moved from the hearth to the doorway of the small corner room, and was standing there looking in at the rope bed, with the quilt and the cherry table with the candle, and the chair by the window. He did not enter. He stood in the threshold and let his eyes move across the room the way he had looked at everything else since stepping down from the cart, slowly and carefully cataloguing the distances between objects and the placement of the rug and the height of the window sash. After a long while he turned his head slightly and said that the room would do, and that he was tired now and thought he might rest. You helped him remove the blue coat, which was heavier than it looked because of the wool lining, and you hung it on a peg by the door where it would be easy to reach. He sat on the edge of the bed, and you knelt to unlace his boots, which were scuffed and worn, and had a small hole in the toe of the left one where the leather had cracked. He watched you do this without speaking, and when the boots were off and placed side by side under the window, he lay back on the quilt with a long, slow exhale that seemed to empty him completely. His eyes closed, and within a few minutes his breathing had settled into the deep, even rhythm of someone who had not slept truly well in a very long time. You stood in the doorway for a while, watching the rise and fall of his chest under the worn shirt, and listening to the small sounds of the house settling around him. The fire in the keeping room popped once, and then was quiet. Outside the cart was already gone, and the road was empty, and the grey light was beginning to soften toward evening. You pulled the door until it was open just a hand's width, enough to hear if he called out, but not enough to let the warmth escape. And you went back to the hearth and sat in the chair that faced the fire and listened to the new silence that had entered the house with him. A silence that was not empty, but full of all the things that did not need to be said yet. The room measured 10 feet by 12 feet, though you had never taken a rule to the walls to confirm this, because the numbers did not matter as much as the feeling of the space and the way the floor sloped toward the east wall where the bed sat. You had first noticed the slope years ago when a dropped thimble rolled across the boards and came to rest against the baseboard, and since then you had learned to accommodate it in small ways, setting the bed frame's left rear leg on a folded square of harness leather that was exactly 3 pennies thick. Without this leather, the bed would tilt, and the sleeper would roll gently toward the wall during the night, a sensation that might be comforting to some, but which you knew would disturb a man who needed everything to stay exactly where he placed it. The walls were plastered and whitewashed a very long time ago, and now the white had aged to the color of cream that had been left in a cool cellar for a week, a soft yellow ivory that caught the lamplight and held it rather than reflecting it back. There was a single crack running from the corner above the window diagonally toward the center of the ceiling, no wider than a piece of sewing thread and no longer than your forearm, and you had watched it for years to see if it would grow, and it had not. In the summer, when the air was damp, the crack seemed to close a little, and in the winter, when the house was dry, it opened again by a fraction of a hair's breadth. A slow breathing of the house itself that you had learned to read like a barometer. The window was the room's only source of natural light. A single sash of 6 panes set into the east wall at a height that allowed a seated person to see out, while a standing person would have to stoop slightly. The glass was old and had small waves and bubbles trapped inside it from the day it was poured, imperfections that made the view outside shift and waver slightly if you moved your head from side to side. You had washed the panes with vinegar water and crumpled newspaper the week before he arrived, and now they were as clear as such glass could ever be, which was not perfectly clear, but clear enough to distinguish the brown shape of the barn wall from the grey shape of the sky. The view from the window was not what anyone would call a pleasant prospect. Directly ahead, no more than 30 feet from the glass, stood the eastern wall of the barn, with its unpainted boards, weathered to a dark silvery brown, and its single small door that led into the hay storage. You could see the iron strap hinges and the wooden latch, and the place where a knot had fallen out of one board, leaving a round hole that sparrows used for nesting in the spring. To the left of the barn wall the view opened slightly to reveal the well sweep. a long tapered pole of ash wood balanced on an upright post, with a stone counterweight tied to one end and a rope and bucket hanging from the other. The sweep rose and fell throughout the day as water was drawn, and when no one was using it, the pole pointed upward at a slight angle toward the sky, like a finger pointing at nothing in particular. To the right of the barn wall, the land sloped down toward the south field, and you could see a long strip of unmown grass that ran all the way to the stone wall at the property line, a strip that had once been hayfield, but had been left to grow wild for 2 summers now because there were not enough hands to cut it and rake it and stack it. The chair by the window was placed so that a person sitting in it would see exactly this arrangement of barn wall and well sweep and uncut grass. And over the first weeks you noticed that he spent more and more time in that chair, not reading or mending or doing anything with his hands, simply sitting and looking out at the fixed landscape. His eyes would move slowly across the view from left to right and then back again, and sometimes they would stop on a particular detail, such as the way the light fell on the iron pump handle, or the shadow of a cloud moving across the barn roof, and he would study that detail for many minutes before moving on to the next. It was not the restless looking of a man who was bored. It was the careful cataloguing of a man who needed to know exactly where everything was and exactly how it would behave. The floorboards in the room were wide planks of pine that had been laid down when the house was built and had shrunk over the years, so that now there were gaps between them wide enough to slide a butter knife into. In the winter cold air seeped up through these gaps, and you could feel it on your bare feet if you walked across the room without shoes, a reminder that the earth was only a few inches below the wood and that the earth was always cold. You had stuffed some of the wider gaps with twists of brown paper, but the paper had dried and fallen out over the summer, and you had not yet replaced it, because the autumn had been mild so far. The bed dominated the room by necessity rather than by design, its rope frame taking up nearly the entire wall opposite the window. The ropes were made of hemp and had been tightened with a wooden key that hung on a nail by the headboard, and they made a faint creaking sound whenever weight shifted on the mattress, a sound that was not unpleasant but simply present, like the ticking of the clock in the keeping room. The headboard was plain maple, with a dark knot in the wood, that you had always thought looked like a closed eye, and now with him in the room, you found yourself glancing at that knot more often, as if it might have opened while you were not looking. On the cherry table beside the bed he would place the tin candlestick and the brown earthenware cup, and a small china saucer that held 3 smooth stones he had picked up from the yard on his 3rd day home. The stones were not remarkable, just ordinary grey field stones worn round by centuries of rain and frost, but he had brought them inside and arranged them on the saucer in a triangle, and moved them slightly every morning so that their positions were never exactly the same. You did not ask him why he did this, and he did not offer an explanation, and after a while the sight of the 3 stones on the saucer became as familiar as the knot in the headboard or the crack in the ceiling. The door to the room was made of the same pine as the floorboards, and it hung on 2 iron hinges that needed oiling. You had decided not to oil them because the creak they made when the door was opened served as a kind of announcement, letting you know when he was rising from the bed or returning to it, and you had learned to read the sound the way you read the crack in the plaster and the slope of the floor. A slow creak that lasted 2 full seconds meant he was opening the door carefully with his good hand while balancing on the cane. A quick creak followed by a pause, and then another quick creak meant he had changed his mind halfway and was closing it again. A creak that came in the middle of the night meant something else entirely, something you did not have words for but understood in your bones. The room had its own particular smell, which was not unpleasant, but was distinct from the rest of the house. It smelled of old plaster and dry wood, and the faint mustiness of the straw tick mattress, and underneath those smells the clean sharp scent of the lye soap you used to wash the floor, and the wool of the blanket and the brass of the candlestick. When you opened the door in the morning after he had slept with it closed all night, there was another smell added to these, the warm human smell of breath and skin and hair that was not dirty exactly but lived in, the smell of a body at rest in a small space for many hours. The light in the room changed throughout the day in ways that you had never noticed before he came to occupy it. In the early morning the east-facing window caught the first pale grey light before the sun had cleared the ridge, and the room was filled with a cool, even illumination that made everything look flat and soft as if seen through thin milk. By mid-morning the sun had risen high enough to clear the barn roof, and a shaft of warmer light fell across the foot of the bed and moved slowly upward over the course of an hour until it reached the pillow and then disappeared as the sun passed behind the barn wall. In the afternoon there was no direct sun at all, only the reflected light from the sky, which was softer and more diffuse and made the whitewashed walls glow with a gentle warmth. By evening, the light had faded to a deep blue-grey, and you would come in with the lit candle and set it on the cherry table, and the small flame would push the shadows back into the corners where they belonged. The temperature of the room was a constant concern that you managed with small adjustments throughout the day. In the morning you would open the window 2 inches exactly, measuring the gap with your thumb, which you knew to be 3/4 of an inch wide at the knuckle, so that the thumb and a little extra made 2 inches. This allowed the cool fresh air to enter without creating a draft that might chill him. Around 4 in the afternoon, when the outside air began to cool toward evening, you would close the window and the room would hold the day's trapped warmth until well after dark. On especially cold nights, you would bring in a warmed brick wrapped in flannel and place it at the foot of the bed under the quilt, and you would hear the small sound he made, not quite a sigh, but something close to it, as the heat reached his feet. The silence in the corner room was different from the silence in the keeping room or the kitchen or the upstairs chambers. In those other spaces, silence was simply the absence of sound, a pause between the noises of daily life. In the corner room silence was a presence, a thick still thing that filled the space between the walls and the floor and the ceiling, and seemed to press gently against your ears when you stepped inside. You learned to move differently in that silence, placing your feet more carefully on the boards, and breathing more shallowly, and letting the door swing shut behind you with the slowest possible motion, so that the latch clicked into place with a sound no louder than a mouse's footfall. He seemed to need this quality of silence the way a plant needs a particular quality of light, and you gave it to him without being asked, because it was one of the few things you could give that cost nothing and meant everything. The geometry of the room was not simply a matter of walls and windows and furniture, but of the paths that connected them, the invisible lines of travel that he traced each day with his body and his cane. From the bed to the window was 4 steps with the cane, a distance he had measured once on the first day and never needed to measure again. From the chair to the door was 5 steps. From the door to the bed was 6 steps if you approached from the foot, 4 if you came from the side. The squeaky board was the 3rd one from the door frame on the left side as you faced the bed, and you watched him learn to avoid it on his nighttime journeys, his foot coming down on the 4th board instead, with the precision of long practice. The walls held the memory of his presence in small ways that accumulated over the weeks. The place on the plaster beside the bed where his fingers touched each night when he reached for the candle had grown slightly darker from the oil of his skin. The floorboard, where he sat on the edge of the bed each morning to pull on his boots, showed a faint depression that matched the curve of his heel. The windowsill had a small collection of objects that he had placed there over time and never moved. A dried bean pod from the garden that rattled when the wind shook the glass. A chip of mica that sparkled in the morning light. A length of twine tied into a complicated knot that you could not undo even when you tried. The room was not a prison, though it might have seemed like one to an outsider who did not understand what it meant to need a space that was entirely known and entirely predictable. It was a container for his recovery, a vessel whose dimensions were exactly matched to the reduced circumference of his life. Within its walls, the world was manageable, because it was small, and because it never changed unless he chose to change it. The 3 stones on the saucer could be rearranged. The window could be opened to 2 inches or closed entirely. The chair could be turned slightly to catch a different angle of the light. These small choices were enough, because they were all the choices he had the strength to make, and the room accepted them all without judgment or complaint. You came to understand that the room was not simply a place where he slept, but a place where he was rebuilding himself in slow increments, like the floorboard swelling shut in summer and the plaster crack breathing with the seasons. Each day he sat in the chair by the window and looked out at the barn wall and the well sweep and the uncut grass, and each day the view was the same, but he was not the same as he had been the day before. The changes were too small to see with the naked eye, like the growth of the moss on the north side of the barn, or the settling of the foundation stones deeper into the earth. But they were happening all the same, and the room held them all in its quiet geometry, and asked for nothing in return. The kitchen work changed in ways that were not immediately obvious, but accumulated over the first weeks, like the thin layer of flour dust that settled on the windowsill and the mantel and the top of the spice box. You'd always cooked in a certain rhythm that matched the seasons and the available stores and the hunger of men who worked from dawn until dark, swinging axes and lifting hay bales and walking behind a plow through heavy soil. That rhythm had been built around the needs of strong bodies that burned through food like a fire burns through dry wood, bodies that required thick slabs of salt pork fried until the edges curled and brown, heavy loaves of wheat bread spread with fresh butter, potatoes boiled and mashed with cream, whole pies eaten at a sitting without leaving a single crumb on the plate. Now you were cooking for a body that had been worn thin by years of poor rations and long marches and a wound that had taken months to close. A body that could not manage the heavy foods it had once demanded. The first morning after his arrival, you had set a plate before him with 2 fried eggs and a thick slice of ham and a piece of bread, toasted on the hearth fork until it was crisp and dark at the edges. He had looked at the plate for a long moment with the same careful attention he gave to everything now, his grey eyes moving across the eggs and the ham and the toast as if they were objects in a museum rather than breakfast. Then he had eaten exactly half of 1 egg and a corner of the toast and had pushed the plate away with a small movement of his good hand that was almost apologetic. His jaw worked slowly on the small bites he took, and you noticed that he chewed only on the right side of his mouth, and that he stopped frequently to rest as if the act of chewing required more strength than he possessed. Later you would learn that a musket ball had passed through the left side of his face, entering just below the cheekbone and exiting near the hinge of his jaw. And though the wound had healed, the bone had hit it wrong, and the muscles had tightened into a permanent stiffness that limited how wide he could open his mouth and how long he could work the jaw before fatigue set in. After that first breakfast, you began to think differently about the food you prepared, not in terms of abundance and satisfaction, but in terms of texture and ease, and the minimal effort required to move sustenance from plate to stomach. The kitchen became a place of slow transformation where hard things were made soft, and rough things were made smooth, and everything was reduced to a consistency that could be managed by a tired jaw and a stomach that had forgotten how to accept more than a few spoonfuls at a time. Porridge became the foundation of the day, the first meal and often the last, and sometimes the only thing he would eat in the long stretch between morning and evening. You made it from cornmeal that had been ground at the mill down by the river crossing, a coarse yellow meal that smelled sweet and dusty when you opened the cloth sack and scooped it into the wooden bowl. The process of making proper porridge was not complicated, but it required patience and attention and a willingness to stand at the hearth for longer than most tasks demanded. You would bring water to a boil in the small iron pot that hung from the crane, measuring the water by eye until it reached the dark stain inside the pot that marked 4 cups. A pinch of salt went in first, just enough to bring out the sweetness of the corn without making the porridge taste of the sea, and then you would take a handful of meal and let it fall through your fingers in a thin steady stream, while your other hand stirred with a long wooden spoon that had been worn smooth by years of this same motion. The stirring was the important part, and you never hurried it. The spoon moved in a slow figure 8 through the bubbling water and meal, scraping the bottom of the pot where the mixture was thickest and most likely to catch and burn, folding the outer edges into the center, and then pushing the center out toward the edges in a continuous gentle circulation. After a few minutes, the meal began to absorb the water and swell, and the mixture thickened from a thin grey liquid into something that looked like wet sand, and then into a proper porridge that held the shape of the spoon's passage for a moment, before slowly filling in behind it. You would add more water in small splashes from the dipper, judging the consistency by how the porridge moved around the spoon, and you would keep stirring and adding and stirring until the grains had softened completely and the whole mass was smooth and flowing and free of any lumps that might catch in a tired throat. The porridge was done when you could lift the spoon and watch the mixture fall back into the pot in a slow ribbon that held together rather than breaking into separate drips. You would swing the crane away from the fire so the pot hung over the cooler part of the hearth, and you would let it rest there for a few minutes while the heat evened out and the last stubborn grains finished softening in the residual warmth. Then you would ladle a small amount into a brown earthenware bowl that you had warmed by setting it near the coals. Not too much, because you had learned that a full bowl was overwhelming, and that he was more likely to finish a modest portion that did not seem like a challenge. A pat of butter went on top to melt into a golden pool, and sometimes a drizzle of sorghum syrup from the stone crock in the pantry if he seemed particularly tired that morning, the dark sweetness cutting through the bland corn flavor and making the porridge taste like something more than sustenance. You carried the bowl into the corner room with the same care you gave to everything now, holding it level so the butter would not slide off the mound of porridge and leave a greasy trail down the side of the bowl. He would be sitting in the chair by the window with his cane across his knees and his eyes fixed on the barn wall, or the well sweep, or the strip of uncut grass. And he would turn his head slowly when you entered and accept the bowl in his good hand, while his other shoulder moved in a small unconscious shrug that was the ghost of a gesture his missing arm could no longer complete. He would eat the porridge in small spoonfuls that he held in his mouth for a moment before swallowing, and he would pause between bites to rest his jaw and look out the window at the unchanging view. And after perhaps 10 minutes the bowl would be empty and you would take it back to the kitchen and rinse it in the bucket of water that sat on the bench by the door. Broth was the other constant, a thin, nourishing liquid that required even more time than porridge, but far less attention once the initial preparation was complete. You made it from beef shank bones that you obtained from the butcher in town once a month when you took the wagon in for supplies, heavy bones with knobs of cartilage at the ends and shreds of dark meat still clinging to the shafts. The butcher knew what you needed and why, and he saved the best bones for you without being asked, wrapping them in brown paper and tying the package with twine that had a loop at one end so you could carry it over your wrist while you managed the other parcels. The bones went into the largest pot you owned, a deep iron vessel that sat on 3 stubby legs and held nearly 2 gallons of water, and you would fill it from the well bucket until the bones were covered by the width of 3 fingers. The broth began its long cooking in the early morning, when the fire was freshly built, and the house was still cool from the night, and it continued all through the day while you did other tasks, the water barely moving with the slowest possible simmer that sent up only an occasional bubble to break the surface. You added things to the pot at different times according to a schedule that you had worked out through trial and error. A whole onion with its papery skin still on went in at the beginning because the skin gave the broth a deeper color. A handful of dried herbs from the bunches that hung from the rafters went in around midday. A few carrots and a stalk of celery, if you had them, went in during the afternoon. And salt went in only at the very end, because you had learned that salting too early, that malt be fixed flat and metallic in a way that could not be fixed. The smell of the broth filled the house slowly over the course of the day, a rich, meaty smell that was not heavy or greasy, but clean and deep and somehow comforting in its constancy. It was the smell of patience. More than the smell of food, the smell of something that could not be rushed, and would not be hurried, and would be ready exactly when it was ready, and not a moment before. By evening, when you finally lifted the pot from the fire and strained the liquid through a cloth into a clean crock, the bones had given up everything they had to give, and the broth was the color of dark amber with a faint shimmer of fat on the surface that you would skim off carefully with a flat spoon and save in a small jar for other uses. You served the broth in a cup rather than a bowl, because a cup could be held in one hand without spilling, and because the act of drinking from a cup required less effort than the act of lifting a spoon repeatedly from bowl to mouth. The cup was the same brown earthenware one that sat on the cherry table by his bed, and you would fill it only halfway, so that the liquid would not slosh over the rim as he raised it to his lips. He would hold the cup in both hands, or rather in his one hand, while the stump of his other arm pressed against the opposite side to steady it, and he would drink the broth in small careful sips that made a soft sound in the quiet room. Sometimes he would finish the cup quickly, and sometimes he would nurse it for an hour, taking a sip and then setting it down and then picking it up again a few minutes later, and you learn not to watch or wait or hover, but simply to let him find his own pace. Between the porridge and the broth, there were other soft things that you prepared in small quantities and offered at intervals throughout the day. Stewed apples made from the withered fruit that you had stored in the cellar, peeled and cored and cut into thin slices that you cooked in a little water until they collapsed into a pale golden mush that tasted of autumn and honey, even though you had added no honey. Mashed turnips from the root pile, boiled until they yielded to the tines of a fork, and then pressed through a sieve with the back of a wooden spoon to remove any fibrous strings that might catch in his throat. The resulting puree, pale and smooth and faintly sweet, with a pat of butter melting into its center. Bread soaked in warm milk until it was soft as pudding. the crusts cut away because they required too much chewing, the remaining crumb absorbing the milk and swelling into a spoonable mass that tasted of wheat and cream, and the faint tang of the sourdough starter you kept in a crock by the hearth. You learned to read the small signs that told you how much he could manage on any given day. If he finished the morning porridge without long pauses between bites, you knew that his jaw was feeling stronger, and you might offer a piece of soft bread with the noon broth. If he left half the porridge untouched, you knew that it was a difficult day, and you would keep the broth thin and warm and available without pressing him to drink. His appetite was not a fixed thing, but a variable that shifted with the weather and his sleep and the unknowable currents of his recovery, and you adjusted to its fluctuations the way you adjusted to the changing seasons, and the available stores, and the endless small demands of keeping a house running. The kitchen itself changed in small ways to accommodate this new way of cooking. A second smaller pot appeared on the hearth dedicated solely to porridge, because the cornmeal left a residue that was difficult to scrub away completely, and you did not want the broth to taste of scorched grain. A new wooden spoon joined the old one, this one with a longer handle that allowed you to stir the deep broth pot without leaning so close to the fire. The salt box moved from the far side of the hearth to a shelf directly beside the work table because you reached for it so often now, salting the porridge water and the broth and the turnip mash in small careful pinches rather than the generous handfuls you had used when cooking for hungry men. The act of carrying food from kitchen to corner room became a small ritual that structured your days. The tray was a simple rectangle of pine with raised edges to keep things from sliding off, and you had sanded it smooth and rubbed it with linseed oil until it glowed a soft honey color. On the tray you placed the bowl or cup and a cloth napkin folded into a triangle, and sometimes a small posy of dried flowers from the garden, if you had them. Nothing elaborate, just a few stems of lavender or yarrow tied with a bit of string. You carried the tray with both hands and walked slowly across the keeping room floor, avoiding the board that squeaked, and the place where the rug had bunched up, and the spot near the hearth where a spilled cup of water had warped the wood into a small ridge. The journey took perhaps 20 steps from the hearth to his door, and each step was deliberate and measured, and gave you time to prepare yourself for whatever you might find when you entered the corner room. The door would be open a hand's width as you had left it, and you would push it wider with your elbow and step inside, and the smell of the room would meet you, the plaster and wood and wool and the faint human warmth of his presence. He would be in the chair or on the bed, or sometimes standing at the window with his forehead resting against the glass, and he would turn when he heard you enter, and his grey eyes would find yours and hold them for a moment before dropping to the tray and what it carried. You would set the tray on the cherry table, or on the wide arm of the chair, or on the bed beside him, depending on where he was, and he would step back and wait for a moment to see if there was anything else he needed. Most days there was nothing, and you would leave him to his meal and return to the kitchen where the broth pot still simmered and the porridge spoon waited in its crock, and the endless quiet work of feeding a wounded body continued in its slow, unremarkable way. The months passed and the food remained the same, and this was not a failure, but a kind of success. A proof that the simple soft things were enough to sustain him through the winter and into the spring. His jaw loosened slightly over time, though it would never open fully again, and he learned to chew on both sides by tilting his head in a particular way that compensated for the stiffness. His stomach grew more accepting of larger portions, though you still served them in the same modest amounts, because you had learned that a second small bowl was better received than a single large one. The broth pot bubbled on the hearth through the cold months and into the warming days of early spring, and the porridge spoon made its slow figure-eights through the yellow meal, and the tray travelled its 20 steps from hearth to corner room 3 times a day, and sometimes 4. Nothing dramatic happened. Nothing needed to happen. The food was warm and soft and reliable, and in the quiet geometry of that corner room, these were the only qualities that mattered. You learned the small rituals of the empty sleeve gradually over the first weeks, not because anyone taught them to you, but because they presented themselves as necessary, and you responded to necessity the way water responds to the shape of a vessel, filling whatever space was offered without complaint or hesitation. The sleeve itself was not empty, in the way a coat hanging on a peg is empty, a simple absence of arm and shoulder and hand. It was empty, in a more complicated way that contained within it the ghost of what had been there before, a memory of fabric that had once been filled and now was not. And this memory required a particular kind of attention that you gave without thinking about it, because thinking about it would have made the task seem larger than it was. The first morning after his arrival, you had stood in the doorway of the corner room while he sat on the edge of the bed and tried to button his shirt with one hand. The shirt was the same one he had worn on the journey home, a plain cotton garment with a standing collar and a row of small bone buttons down the front, and he had managed to get his right arm into its sleeve without difficulty because that was the arm that remained. The left sleeve hung loose and empty from the shoulder seam and swayed slightly when he moved, and you watched him grasp the front placket with his fingers and try to guide the first button through its hole using only his thumb and forefinger, while the rest of the shirt shifted and pulled and refused to stay in place. He worked at it for perhaps 2 minutes, his jaw set in the way you were already learning to recognize as the sign of a man who was determined not to ask for something he could not do himself. And then the button slipped from his fingers for the 3rd time, and he let his hand fall to his lap and sat very still looking at the floor. You crossed the room without speaking and knelt in front of him and took the edges of the shirt in your hands. His eyes followed your movements, but he did not pull away or tell you to stop, and you understood that this was his way of asking, without using words. You buttoned the shirt from the bottom up because you had learned long ago that starting at the bottom prevented the placket from pulling crooked, and your fingers moved through the familiar motions while his breathing slowed and deepened above you. When you reached the top button just under his chin, you fastened it loosely, leaving room for 2 fingers between the collar and his neck, because you knew he would want it that way, not tight against his throat like a Sunday meeting, but comfortable and easy, like a workday at home. The left sleeve was the next problem, and it was a problem that repeated itself every morning and every evening, and every time he changed from his day shirt to his night shirt and back again. The sleeve hung down past where his elbow would have been, a length of cotton that ended in a plain hem with no cuff, because the cuff had been cut away by whoever had treated his wound. Cut away and not replaced because there was no point in replacing a cuff that would never be buttoned around a wrist again. The raw edge had been turned under and stitched with small, neat stitches that you examined once when he was sleeping. Stitches made by someone who knew how to sew, but who had been in a hurry. A field surgeon's assistant perhaps, or a nurse in a hospital ward where there were too many empty sleeves to spend much time on any single one. You developed a method for managing the sleeve that became as automatic as buttoning the shirt. First, you would gather the fabric in your hand, starting at the shoulder seam and working downward, folding the excess material into a neat bundle that lay flat against his side. Then you would roll the bundle once toward his body, so that the raw hem was hidden and the whole mass was contained within a smooth cylinder of cloth that ended just below his shoulder. Finally, you would secure the bundle with a small brass safety pin that you kept in a china dish on the cherry table, along with the 3 smooth stones, pushing the pin through the outer layer of fabric and the inner folds and closing it with a soft click that was one of the quiet sounds of the morning routine. The pin had to be placed just so, not too high where it might press against the tender scar tissue of his shoulder, and not too low where the weight of the fabric might pull it loose during the day. You found the right spot through trial and error, and after a week your fingers knew it without your eyes needing to check. The brass safety pin was a small thing, but it became important in the way that small things become important when they're used every day and relied upon without thought. You had found it in your sewing basket among the stray buttons and lengths of thread and the small pair of scissors with the loose hinge, and it was exactly like a dozen other pins you owned, except that this one was slightly longer than the others and had a stronger spring that held it closed with a reassuring firmness. You kept it in the china dish on the cherry table, and you never used it for anything else. And when you pinned his sleeve each morning, you did it with the same care you gave to the porridge and the broth and the opening of the window 2 inches. The management of the sleeve extended beyond the morning pinning into other small acts of assistance that you performed without being asked, and he accepted without acknowledgement, because acknowledgement would have required words, and words were still difficult for him in those first months. His trousers presented a particular challenge that you solved by cutting a length of twine and threading it through the waistband and tying it in a loop that he could grasp with his teeth while his good hand worked the buttons. You watched him do this once from the doorway without letting him see you, The way he would lean forward and catch the twine between his front teeth and pull his head back to draw the waistband tight against his hips while his fingers fumbled with the first button. It was an awkward maneuver that required practice and patience, and a willingness to look foolish in the privacy of his own room. And you understood that this was why he did it alone, rather than asking for your help. Shaving was a more complicated matter, and one that you approached with a caution that bordered on reverence, because the straight razor was a dangerous tool in the best of circumstances, and these were not the best of circumstances. He had arrived with a razor in a small leather case that was stained dark from years of handling, and the razor itself was a plain instrument, with a bone handle that had yellowed with age and a blade that held an edge well if it was stropped regularly. He insisted on shaving himself, and you did not argue, because you understood that there were some things a man needed to do for himself, even if doing them was difficult and slow, and required adaptations that a whole man would never need to consider. The method he developed for shaving with one hand was a small marvel of ingenuity that you observed from the corner of your eye while pretending to dust the mantle or straighten the quilt. He would sit in the chair by the window with a small mirror propped against the sash, a round mirror in a tin frame that you'd brought down from the upstairs bedroom and positioned so it caught the morning light. He would lather his face using a cake of shaving soap in a wooden bowl, working the brush with his good hand until the soap frothed into a white cream that he applied to his cheeks and chin and upper lip with small dabbing motions. The razor he held in his right hand with the blade opened and locked into position, and instead of moving the razor across his face the way a barber would do, he held the razor steady and moved his face against the blade. This reversal of the usual motion required a different kind of control, a slow turning of the head that brought the laddered skin into contact with the stationary edge. He would start at his right sideburn and turn his head slowly to the left so that the blade traveled across his cheek in a smooth, even stroke, and then he would wipe the razor on a cloth draped over his knee and reposition and do it again slightly lower. The hollow of his neck was the most difficult part because he could not see it in the mirror and had to work by feel alone, tilting his chin up and stretching the skin tight with his fingers while the blade scraped gently across the tender flesh. You watched him do this 100 times over the months, and you never stopped holding your breath during the neck strokes, even though he never cut himself, not once, not even a small nick that would bead with blood. The stropping of the razor was a sound that became as familiar as the creak of the door hinges and the tap of the cane on the floorboards. He would hook the leather strop over the latch of the closed door so that it hung down in a long brown strap, and he would hold the free end in his good hand and draw the razor across the leather in a steady rhythm that went on for several minutes. The sound was a soft shushing noise followed by a faint ring as the blade lifted and turned and came back down on the leather for the return stroke. Shush and ring and shush and ring repeated until the edge was as sharp as he could make it. You came to associate this sound with the late afternoon when the light was beginning to fade and the day's small tasks were winding down toward evening, and it was a comforting sound because it meant he was still there in the corner room doing the things that needed to be done. The absence of the left arm manifested in other small ways that you noticed and accommodated without comment. His coat hung differently on the peg by the door, the left shoulder sloping down more sharply than the right, so that the whole garment seemed to lean toward the empty space. You learned to button the coat for him when he needed to go outside, working from the bottom up the way you did with his shirt, and then stepping back while he adjusted the collar with his good hand. His gloves were a particular problem because he had only one hand to put them on, and only one glove that needed wearing, a right glove of dark brown leather that you kept in the drawer of the cherry table, along with its unused mate. The left glove remained in the drawer month after month, its leather growing stiff and its shape holding the memory of fingers that were no longer there to fill it. And sometimes you would take it out and turn it over in your hands and wonder if you should throw it away or give it to someone who could use it, or simply leave it where it was, as a quiet reminder of what had been lost. The cane was not part of his body, but it functioned as an extension of it in ways that blurred the line between tool and limb. He had arrived with a plain hickory stick that the driver had handed him from the cart, and for the first weeks he used it constantly, leaning on it when he stood and tapping it ahead of him when he walked and hooking the curved handle over the arm of the chair when he sat so it would be within reach. The brass ferrule at the tip made a small round depression in the floorboards wherever he paused for any length of time, and you noticed these marks appearing in new places around the house as he slowly expanded the territory he was willing to navigate. A mark by the hearth where he stood to warm himself. A mark by the hearth where he stood to warm himself. A mark by the kitchen door where he watched you work. A mark by the front window where he looked out at the road. The cane developed its own small history of wear and repair over the months. The varnish on the shaft wore thin in the place where his hand gripped it most often, a spot about a third of the way down from the curve where the wood grew smooth and dark from the oil of his palm. The brass ferrule wore down on one side from the way he dragged it slightly when he walked, and eventually it wore through entirely, and you had to take the cane to the smith in town who fitted a new ferrule and tapped it into place with a few blows of a small hammer. The smith had looked at the worn ferrule and then at you, and had not asked any questions, just done the work and handed the cane back and refused the coin you offered, because some things were understood without needing to be spoken. The empty sleeve was not only a practical matter of pins and buttons and the careful arrangement of fabric, it was also a presence in the room, a constant reminder that sat beside him in the chair and lay next to him in the bed, and accompanied him on his slow journeys from window to door and back again. You learned to see it without staring, to acknowledge it without making it the center of attention, to treat it as simply another part of the room's geometry, like the slope of the floor and the crack in the plaster and the 3 stones on the saucer. It was what it was, and it required what it required, and you provided what was needed without making a fuss, because making a fuss would have been worse than useless, would have drawn attention to the loss rather than the accommodation of the loss. The nights were sometimes difficult in ways that had nothing to do with the sleeve and everything to do with what the sleeve represented. He would wake in the dark with a cry that was not loud, but was sharp and sudden, and cut through the silence of the house like a stone through still water. You would rise from your chair by the hearth where you had been dozing and go to the door of the corner room and stand there for a moment listening to his breathing, which would be fast and shallow, and then gradually slowing as he came back to himself. Sometimes you would go in and sit on the edge of the bed and rest your hand on his shoulder above the pinned sleeve, not gripping or squeezing, but just resting it there lightly so he would know he was not alone. Other times you would stay in the doorway and wait until his breathing evened out, and then return to your chair without having entered the room at all. You learned to read these nights the way you read the weather and the broth pot and the signs of his appetite, and you responded with whatever was needed and no more. The months passed and the sleeve remained pinned, and the razor continued its slow scrape across his lathered cheek, and the cane made its marks on the floorboards in ever-widening circles as his strength returned by increments too small to measure. You stopped noticing the empty sleeve after a while, in the way that you stopped noticing the slope of the floor and the squeaky board and the crack in the plaster, not because they had disappeared, but because they had become part of the familiar landscape of your days. The sleeve was simply there, like the window and the bed and the cherry table, a feature of the room that required certain small attentions at certain regular intervals and otherwise asked for nothing at all. One morning in the early spring, when the light was beginning to change and the air through the open window carried the first faint smell of thawing earth, you went into the corner room with his clean shirt and found him already dressed. He was standing by the window with his back to you, and the shirt was buttoned and the sleeve was pinned, and he was looking out at the barn wall and the well sweep and the strip of field where the snow had melted away to reveal the brown grass underneath. He turned when he heard you and his grey eyes met yours, and he said that he had managed it himself this time, and that it had taken a while, but he had done it. You nodded and set the clean shirt on the bed and took the soiled one from the chair and carried it out to the wash bucket without saying anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said. The sleeve would still need pinning on other mornings, and the razor would still need stropping, and the coat would still need buttoning from the bottom up. But something small had shifted in the quiet geometry of the corner room, and you both knew it without having to name it. The barometer hung on a nail beside the back door, where it had been for as long as you could remember. A round brass instrument with a yellowed paper face and a single black needle that moved in small increments across a scale marked with words that had faded almost to illegibility. The words had once read fair and change and rain and stormy, but now they were only suggestions of themselves, pale ghosts of letters that you could read only because you had seen them so many times that your memory filled in what your eyes could no longer discern. The brass casing was tarnished to a dull brown, except for a bright spot on the rim where fingers had touched it over the years, polishing the metal without meaning to, and the glass cover had a small crack in the lower left corner that had been there since before you were born and would be there long after you were gone. You had never paid much attention to the barometer before he came home. It was simply there like the hook by the door, and the worn spot on the threshold, and the spider that lived in the corner of the window frame, a part of the house that existed without requiring anything from you. Now you tapped the glass each morning with the tip of your finger and watched the needle jump and settle, and you noted its position in a small book that you kept on the windowsill, along with a stub of pencil that you sharpened with a paring knife when it grew too blunt to make a clear mark. The book was made of brown paper folded and stitched down the center, and you had ruled lines across the pages with a straight edge and a piece of charcoal, so that each day had its own row for recording the needle's position, and the look of the sky and the direction of the wind. The weather became important because it was the only thing that changed in any noticeable way from one day to the next. The view from the window remained the same as it had been on the day he arrived, and the day before that, and the day before that, stretching back through years of autumns and winters and springs. The barn wall was always the barn wall, its silver-brown boards fading and weathering, but never transforming into something else. The well sweep was always the well sweep, its ash pole pointing upward at the same angle, toward the same empty patch of sky. The strip of uncut grass was always the strip of uncut grass, growing taller in the summer and lying flat under the snow in the winter, but never becoming a hayfield again, because there was no one to cut it and rake it and stack it in the barn. The weather was the only variable in an otherwise fixed equation, and you both watched it with an attention that bordered on devotion. He watched the sky from his chair by the window, and you watched it from the kitchen door and the garden and the path to the woodpile, and in the evening you compared your observations in the same way that other households might discuss the news from town, or the price of flour, or the health of distant relatives. He would say that the clouds had been moving from the northwest all afternoon, and that they had thickened around 3 o'clock, and that the light had taken on a yellowish cast that reminded him of a storm he had seen once in Virginia. You would say that the wind had shifted at midday, and that the leaves on the ground were scurrying toward the south fence line, and that the smell of the air had changed from dry to damp. These exchanges were not conversations in the usual sense because they contained no opinions and no emotions and no references to anything beyond the immediate evidence of the senses. They were simply reports delivered in calm voices and received with calm attention, a sharing of information that passed the time and filled the silence and gave shape to days that might otherwise have had no shape at all. The clouds became a subject of careful study because they were never exactly the same from one hour to the next. You learned to distinguish the high, thin cirrus wisps that meant fair weather would continue for at least another day. Their feathery strands stretched across the blue like wool, caught on a thorn bush and pulled into long translucent threads. These clouds moved so slowly that you could not see them moving, and you had to look away and look back again after several minutes to confirm that their position had shifted relative to the window frame. They meant that the barometer would stay steady, and the air would remain dry, and the laundry hung on the line would stiffen and bleach in the pale winter sun. The cumulus clouds were different, white and rounded and piled on top of one another like the bubbles in a pot of boiling porridge, their edges sharp and distinct against the sky. These clouds appeared most often in the late morning, when the sun had warmed the earth enough to send columns of air rising upward, and they drifted across the window from west to east with a stately slow motion that you could track if you had the patience to sit and watch for half an hour. Some days they remained separate and distinct and passed over without incident, and the barometer needle would hold steady or rise slightly, and the afternoon would be clear and cool. Other days they would grow and darken at their bases and join together into a solid grey mass that covered the sky from horizon to horizon, and then the needle would begin to fall, and you would know that rain was coming before the first drop touched the glass of the window. The rain itself was a visitor that arrived in many different forms throughout the year, each with its own character and its own sound, and its own way of changing the atmosphere of the corner room. The spring rains were gentle and persistent, and smelled of wet earth and the first green things pushing up through the dead grass, and they fell in a steady drizzle that went on for hours and sometimes days, without ever becoming heavy enough to pound against the roof. The sound of spring rain was a soft pattering that blended with the drip from the eaves and the gurgle of water running through the downspout and into the rain barrel, a layered sound that filled the silence without disturbing it. He would sit in his chair and listen to this sound with his eyes half closed and his breathing slow and even, and you knew without asking that the rain was a comfort to him in some way that neither of you needed to explain. The summer rains were different, sudden and violent and gone as quickly as they came. They arrived in the late afternoon when the heat had built all day until the air felt thick and heavy and the leaves on the trees hung limp and motionless. The sky would darken from the west in a great purple-black wall that advanced across the fields like a curtain being drawn, and then the first fat drops would spatter against the window glass, and the wind would rise and the rain would come down in sheets that obscured the barn wall and the well sweep and the strip of uncut grass. These storms lasted perhaps 20 minutes, or perhaps an hour, and when they passed the air was washed clean, and the light was different, and the world smelled of ozone and wet dust and the crushed leaves of the mint that grew by the kitchen door. He did not seem to mind these storms, but he did not welcome them either, and you noticed that he would grip the arm of the chair a little tighter when the thunder rolled across the roof and the whole house shook with the force of it. The autumn rains were the ones he seemed to prefer, though he never said so directly, and you never asked. They were cool and steady and grey, and they fell from skies that were the same colour as his eyes, a soft, even grey that made the whitewashed walls of the corner room glow with a gentle warmth. The sound of autumn rain on the cedar shake roof was a deeper sound than spring rain, a low drumming that resonated through the rafters and into the plaster and made the whole room feel like the inside of a wooden instrument that was being played very softly by an unseen hand. He would sit for hours on autumn rainy days without moving, without reading, without doing anything with his hands, just sitting and listening and watching the water run down the window glass in slow, branching rivulets that merged and divided and merged and divided and merged again. The snow was different from the rain in every way that mattered. It came silently and it stayed for weeks, and it changed the quality of the light that entered the corner room because the white ground reflected the pale winter sun upward into the window instead of absorbing it. The room was brighter on snowy days than on rainy days, even though the sky was often the same shade of grey, and this brightness was a soft, diffuse glow that seemed to come from everywhere at once and cast no shadows. He would watch the snow fall with the same patient attention he gave to everything, his eyes following the individual flakes as they drifted past the window on their long, slow journey from cloud to ground. The snow accumulated on the window sill in a thin white line that you brushed away each morning when you opened the window 2 inches, and it accumulated on the roof of the barn and on the well sweep and on the strip of uncut grass until the whole world outside was simplified into smooth white curves and plains. The measurement of snow became another small ritual that you performed without being asked, and he observed without commenting. After each snowfall, you would take a wooden ruler from the drawer in the keeping room and carry it outside and push it straight down into the snow in a place where the ground was level and the drift had not piled too deep. You would note the depth where the snow reached on the ruler, and then you would come back inside and write the number in the brown paper book, along with the barometer reading and the direction of the wind. The numbers accumulated over the winter, and you could look back through the pages and see how the snow had come and gone, and come again, a record of the season's passage that was more reliable than memory, because memory could not be trusted to hold the exact depth of a snowfall that had melted 3 weeks ago. The wind was harder to measure than the snow or the rain, but you learned to read it by its effects on the things you could see. The wind vane on the barn roof was a simple iron rooster that had lost most of its tail feathers to rust and now pointed in whatever direction the wind dictated, with a small squeak that you could hear from the kitchen door if the air was still enough. You noted its position each morning and recorded it in the book with a single letter that stood for north or south or east or west or any of the combinations in between. The wind from the northwest was the coldest, and it rattled the window glass and found every gap in the plaster and every crack in the floorboards and made the candle flame dance and flicker even when the door was closed. On these days, you would bring an extra blanket to the corner room and tuck it around his shoulders while he sat in the chair, and he would accept it with a small nod and pull it closer with his good hand and continue watching the sky. The wind from the south was warmer and carried with it the smell of things that were far away, the smell of wet earth from the river bottom and wood smoke from distant chimneys, and sometimes a faint sweetness that might have been the first hint of spring even in the depths of winter. On these days, he would ask you to open the window a little wider than the usual 2 inches, perhaps 3 inches or even 4, and he would sit with his face turned toward the opening and breathe the warmer air in long, slow breaths that seemed to reach all the way to the bottom of his lungs. You did not know why the south wind affected him this way, and you did not ask, but you noticed that he slept better on the nights after a south wind had blown through the room, and that his appetite was stronger the following morning. The sunbeam was the most reliable measure of time in the corner room because it appeared and disappeared with a regularity that no weather could entirely disrupt, even on cloudy days when its edges were soft and diffuse rather than sharp and bright. On clear mornings the beam entered through the east window as soon as the sun cleared the ridge and fell across the foot of the bed in a rectangle of warm light that was exactly the width of the window sash and slightly longer than it was wide. Over the course of the morning the rectangle moved with an agonizing slowness across the rag rug and up the plaster wall, its leading edge advancing perhaps the width of a finger every 10 minutes if you have the patience to mark its progress with a small object placed at the edge. He did this sometimes with one of the 3 stones from the saucer, moving it every so often to keep it precisely at the boundary between light and shadow, and you would find the stone in a new position each time you entered the room. The sunbeam reached the pillow around midday, if the sky was clear and the season was right, and for a few minutes it would warm the place where his head rested at night, and then it would climb higher and disappear as the sun passed behind the barn wall. In the afternoon there was no direct sun at all, only the reflected light from the sky and the snow, if there was snow, and the room would settle into a long grey twilight that lasted until you brought the candle in that evening. He seemed to prefer these grey hours to the bright ones, though you could not have said why, and he never explained. Perhaps it was simply that the grey light asked nothing of him, made no demands on his attention, allowed him to sit and drift without the sharp edges that the sunbeam drew across the floor and the wall and the bed. The weather in the book accumulated over the months and the seasons, and became a record of the year's slow turning that you could hold in your hands and page through on long winter evenings when the snow was falling and the wind was from the northwest and there was nothing to do but wait for spring. The entries were brief and factual and contained no opinions or emotions, just the barometer reading and the wind direction and the depth of snow and a few words about the clouds. Cirrus wisps high and thin. Cumulus towers building in the west. Grey overcast no breaks. Rain steady since morning. Snow fine and dry, 6 inches new. The words were like the weather itself, repetitive and predictable, and somehow comforting in their refusal to surprise or startle or demand anything more than simple observation. The barometer needle moved through its slow arcs across the faded paper face, and you tapped it each morning and recorded its position, and he watched the sky from his chair, and together you built a shared understanding of the world outside the corner room without ever leaving it. The weather came and went and came again, and the seasons turned and the view from the window remained the same. And this was enough because it was all there was, and all there needed to be. The road stayed empty and the house stayed quiet, and the only visitor was the rain on the roof and the snow on the sill, and the wind that rattled the glass and then passed on to rattle other windows in other houses that were too far away to see or hear or think about. The piece of pine had been sitting on the windowsill for 3 days before he picked it up, a scrap left over from the time when you had repaired the loose board on the porch step and had sawed off the excess length with the old crosscut that hung from 2 nails in the tool shed. It was not a special piece of wood in any way that you could see, just a rectangular cut-off about the length of your hand and the width of 2 fingers, pale yellow-white with a straight grain and a small knot near one end that looked like a dark eye. You had left it there without thinking, because there were always small things on the windowsill, the dried bean pod and the chip of mica and the length of twine tied into its complicated knot, and one more object did not seem to matter either way. He reached for it on a grey afternoon when the rain had been falling steadily since morning and the barometer needle had dropped to a position you had not seen since the previous spring. His good hand closed around the wood and he lifted it from the sill and turned it over, slowly examining all 4 sides and both ends with the same careful attention he gave to everything that came within his reach. You watched from the doorway, where you had been standing with a cup of broth that was slowly cooling in your hands, and you saw him run his thumb along the grain, testing the smoothness of the surface, and the way the light caught the faint lines that ran through the pale wood. Then he looked up and met your eyes and asked without speaking if there was a knife he could use. Not a good knife from the kitchen drawer, but something smaller and sharper that could be controlled with one hand. You went to the keeping room and opened the drawer where the small tools lived, the ones that were too useful to throw away, but not important enough to have a proper place in the tool shed. Among the stub of pencil and the ball of twine and the tin of buttons and the broken scissors with the loose hinge, there was a folding knife with a bone handle that had belonged to your father and his father before him. A simple thing with a single blade that locked open when you pressed a small metal tab. The blade was stained dark from years of use, and the edge was still sharp, because no one had used it for anything important in a very long time. You carried it back to the corner room and held it out to him, and he took it with his good hand and opened the blade and tested the edge against the ball of his thumb in a gesture that was so familiar it made your breath catch for a moment. The first cut was tentative, a small shaving that curled away from the wood and fell to the floor where it lay like a pale crescent against the dark boards. He looked at it for a moment and then made another cut and another, each one slightly more confident than the last, as his fingers remembered the feel of the knife and the resistance of the wood and the angle that produced the cleanest shaving. The sound of the blade against the pine was a soft whisper that repeated every few seconds, a sound so quiet that you could only hear it if you were listening for it, and even then it blended with the sound of the rain on the roof and the hiss of the fire in the keeping room and the small creaks of the house settling around you both. The shavings accumulated on the floor beside the chair in a small pile of thin curls that caught the grey light from the window and held it in their pale spirals. Some of them were long and unbroken and coiled like watch springs, and some were short and snapped in the middle where the grain had turned or a knot had interrupted the smooth path of the blade. He did not seem to be making anything in particular, not a spoon or a figure or any object you could name, just reducing the piece of pine by small increments and letting the shavings fall where they would. His face was relaxed in a way you had not seen before, the lines around his mouth and eyes softening as his hand worked the knife in a steady rhythm that asked nothing of him but patience and attention. The smell of the pine filled the corner room over the course of the afternoon, a clean, sharp scent that cut through the mustiness of the plaster, and the wool of the blanket and the faint human warmth of his presence. It was the smell of the forest on a hot day, when the sun had been baking the needles and the bark until the air itself seemed to be made of resin and light, and it brought with it a memory of something you could not quite name, a time when the woods behind the house had been full of tall, straight pines that swayed in the wind and dropped their cones on the soft brown carpet of needles. Most of those pines were gone now, cut down for lumber and firewood and the building of barns and fences, but the smell remained trapped inside this small scrap of wood, and now it was being released, one shaving at a time, into the quiet air of the corner room. The piece of pine lasted for 3 days of intermittent work, shrinking from its original rectangular shape into something smaller and rounder and smoother that fit perfectly in the palm of his hand. He never said what it was supposed to be, and you never asked, but you noticed that he kept it on the windowsill next to the bean pod and the mica and the twine, and sometimes when he was sitting in the chair looking out at the barn wall, he would pick it up and turn it over in his fingers and run his thumb across its smooth surface. It had no name and no purpose and no reason to exist except that he had made it, and that seemed to be enough. The saddle came later, when the weather had turned cold and the ground was frozen hard, and there was no possibility of going outside except to fetch wood and water and empty the slop bucket. It had been hanging on a wooden peg in the barn for 4 years, a good saddle with a deep seat and high cantle and brass fittings that had once been polished to a bright shine by the rubbing of leather against cloth and the hands of the man who had owned it. Now it was dull and stiff, and covered with a fine grey dust that had settled into every crease and crevice, and the leather had dried and cracked in places where the oil had evaporated and left the fibres bare and vulnerable. You had looked at it many times over the years and thought about bringing it inside and cleaning it and oiling it and keeping it ready for the day when it might be needed again, but you had never done it because there were always other tasks that seemed more urgent, and because the sight of it hanging there alone in the dark barn made something in your chest tighten in a way you did not want to examine. He asked about the saddle one evening when the wind was from the northwest and the candle flame was dancing in the draught that seeped through the window frame. His voice was low and careful, and he did not look at you when he spoke, just kept his eyes on the candle and the way the light moved across the whitewashed wall. You told him it was still in the barn, hanging on the same peg where he had left it, and you asked if he wanted you to bring it inside. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he nodded once and said that it might need cleaning, and that he thought he could manage it if you brought it in and set it on the floor by his chair. The saddle was heavier than you remembered, or perhaps you were simply not as strong as you had been 4 years ago, and you had to rest twice on the short walk from the barn to the house, with the saddle draped over your arms and the stirrups bumping against your legs. The leather was cold and stiff, and it smelled of the barn, of hay and horses, and the faint ammonia of old manure and the dry dust of summer that had settled on every surface and never been disturbed. You carried it into the corner room and set it down on the floor beside his chair, where a square of old blanket had been spread to protect the boards from the oil and the dirt. He looked at it for a long time without moving, his grey eyes travelling across the seat and the skirts and the brass fittings as if he were reading a book written in a language he had once known but had not spoken in many years. The cleaning of the saddle became a project that occupied him for many days, not because there was any hurry to finish, but because the work itself was the point, and the pace was dictated by his strength and his attention and the slow, careful movements of one hand. You brought him a small tin of neatsfoot oil from the tool shed, and a sponge that had been cut from a larger piece, and a soft cloth that had once been part of a worn-out shirt, and you set them on the floor beside the saddle where he could reach them without straining. He would dip the sponge into the oil and squeeze out the excess, and then begin to work the leather in small circular motions that started at the pommel and moved slowly backward toward the cantle. The smell of the neatsfoot oil was rich, an animal and somehow comforting, a smell that spoke of stables and tack rooms and the patient care of things that would last for generations if they were tended properly. It blended with the smell of the pine shavings that still lingered in the room, and the smell of the wood smoke from the keeping room, and the smell of the wool blanket and the plaster, and all the other smells that made up the particular atmosphere of the corner room. He worked in silence broken only by the soft sound of the sponge moving across the leather, and the occasional creak of the chair when he shifted his weight, and you would come and go with cups of broth and bowls of porridge, and the small attentions that structured your days. The brass fittings took the longest because they required a different kind of attention and a different set of small, precise movements. You brought him a tin of brass polish that had dried to a hard cake in its container, and you showed him how to add a few drops of water and work the paste into a soft consistency with the tip of his finger. He would take a small amount in the corner of the cloth and rub it into the brass in tiny circles, and then he would wait for it to dry to a haze and buff it off with a clean part of the cloth. The transformation was slow and gradual, like everything else in the corner room, the dull brown metal giving way inch by inch to a warm golden glow that caught the candlelight and threw it back in small bright points. The stirrups were iron rather than brass, and they had rusted in the damp of the barn, a fine orange-brown coating that came off on the cloth in streaks. You brought him a piece of emery cloth from the tool shed, and he worked the rust away with patient strokes that left the iron dark and smooth and faintly shining. The stirrup leathers were stiff and cracked, and he oiled them over and over until they began to soften and regain some of their old flexibility, bending without protest when he worked them between his fingers. The whole saddle was coming back to life under his hands, not quickly and not dramatically, but in small increments that you could only see if you looked away and looked back again after several days. The work was not for utility, because there was no horse to wear the saddle, and no prospect of riding even if there had been a horse. A man with one arm and a stiff jaw and a leg that tired after 20 steps across the floor could not sit a horse and manage the reins and keep his balance on uneven ground. The work was for the texture of the leather under his fingers, and the resistance of the brass under the cloth, and the smell of the oil and the polish, and the quiet satisfaction of seeing something neglected return to a state of care. It filled the hours between morning and evening, and it gave his hands something to do that was not simply waiting, and this was enough, because enough was all there needed to be. The tack and harness came after the saddle was finished, and gleaming and sitting on the floor like a monument to patience. There were bridles and reins and a heavy leather collar that had been used for ploughing, all of them hanging from pegs in the barn, and all of them in need of the same slow attention that had restored the saddle. He brought them in one piece at a time over the course of several weeks, carrying them across the frozen yard and into the warmth of the keeping room, and then into the corner room where he received them with a small nod and added them to the growing collection of leather on the floor beside his chair. The mending was different from the cleaning because it required a needle and thread, and a different set of small, precise movements that he had to learn all over again with one hand. You brought him a curved needle from your sewing basket, the kind that was used for stitching heavy canvas and leather and upholstery, and a spool of waxed thread that was strong and dark brown and smelled faintly of beeswax and pine tar. He held the needle in his good hand and looked at it for a long time, and then asked you to show him how to thread it with one hand, and you showed him how to hold the needle between his knees and guide the thread through the eye with his fingers and pull it through and tie a knot at the end. The first stitches were clumsy and uneven, and he pulled them out 3 times before he was satisfied with the tension and the spacing and the way the thread lay flat against the leather. The sound of the needle pulling through the punched hole was a soft zipping noise that repeated every few seconds, a sound that joined the other sounds of the corner room in a quiet chorus of small occupations. He mended a broken bridle first, stitching the parted leather back together with a row of small, even stitches that followed the original line, and then he moved on to a rein that had worn thin where it rubbed against the bit, reinforcing it with a patch of leather cut from an old strap that had no other use. The work went on through the winter and into the early spring, not because there was so much to do, but because he did it so slowly and because the doing itself was the only goal. The collection of leather on the floor grew and shrank as pieces were finished and returned to their pegs in the barn and new pieces were brought in to take their place. The smell of neatsfoot oil and brass polish and waxed thread became the permanent smell of the corner room, overwriting the mustiness of the plaster and the faint sourness of the straw tick mattress and the human warmth of his presence. It was the smell of industry without urgency, of labor without demand, of a man rebuilding himself one small task at a time in the quiet geometry of his small room. The days passed and the leather grew soft and supple, and the brass fittings gleamed in the candlelight, and the mended places were strong and neat and almost invisible if you did not know where to look. He never spoke about the work, and you never asked about it, and this silence was not an absence of communication, but a form of it, a shared understanding that the work was its own meaning and needed no explanation. The saddle sat on the floor by the window, and sometimes you would see him reach out and touch it with his good hand, not to clean it or mend it, but simply to feel the texture of the leather and the smoothness of the brass and the solid weight of a thing that had been neglected and was now cared for again. The road outside remained empty, and the seasons turned and the barometer needle moved through its slow arcs, and in the corner room the steady occupations of whittle and wax continued without hurry and without end. The floorboards in the corner room had their own language which you learned to read over the first months, in the same way you learned to read the barometer and the broth pot, and the small signs of his appetite. Not because anyone taught you, but because you were there and listening, and the boards spoke whether you wanted them to or not. Each plank had its own voice and its own way of responding to weight and pressure and the slow passage of feet across its surface, and these voices together made a map of the room that you could navigate in complete darkness if you needed to, a map that existed only in sound and memory and the feel of the wood through the soles of your shoes. The board nearest the door was the loudest, a wide pine plank that had warped slightly over the years so that its inner edge rose just enough to catch the edge of the door when it swung inward. This board complained whenever anyone entered or left the room, a low groaning creak that started at the threshold and travelled the length of the plank like a ripple moving across still water. You would learn to step over this board entirely, placing your foot on the smaller board just beyond it, which was silent and solid and did not shift under your weight, and you had watched him learn the same lesson over the course of several days, first stepping on the loud board and pausing at the sound, and then correcting his path the next time and the time after that until the correction became automatic. The squeaky board was the third one from the door frame on the left side, as you faced the bed, and it was the one that mattered most because it lay directly in the path between the bed and the window and the bed and the door, a path that he travelled many times each day and sometimes in the middle of the night when the house was dark and still and any sound would carry through the walls like a stone dropped into a pond. The squeak was not loud, just a small high-pitched complaint that sounded like a mouse being stepped on very gently, but it was distinct and unmistakable, and it had the power to wake you from a light sleep in the chair by the hearth. He had discovered this board on his second night home, when he had risen in the dark to make his slow way to the window and had placed his bare foot directly on the spot where the board was weakest. The squeak had cut through the silence of the house, and you had heard it from the keeping room and had risen and gone to his door to find him standing frozen in the middle of the floor with his cane in his hand, and his face turned toward the sound as if it were a living thing that might attack again. After that night he learned to avoid the squeaky board with a precision that seemed almost uncanny, his foot coming down on the fourth board instead, which was silent and firm and gave no indication that it had ever been stepped on at all. You watched him do this many times from the doorway or from the corner of your eye while pretending to be occupied with something else, and you marveled at the way his body had mapped the room and stored the map in some part of his mind that did not require conscious thought to access. He never looked down at the floor when he walked, never hesitated or felt ahead with his cane, just moved from bed to window to door with the certainty of a man who had lived in this room for years rather than weeks. The distance from the bed to the window was 4 steps with the cane, a measurement that he had established on the first morning and never varied unless he was feeling particularly tired, and then it might be 5 smaller steps with longer pauses between them. The first step took him from the edge of the bed to the foot of the rag rug. The second step crossed the rug to its far edge. The third step brought him to within reach of the windowsill, and the fourth step was a small adjustment that positioned him directly in front of the glass where he could stand and look out at the barn wall and the well sweep and the strip of uncut grass. The cane tapped once for each step, a soft thud of the brass ferrule against the wood that marked the rhythm of his passage, like a metronome set to the slowest possible tempo. The distance from the chair to the door was 5 steps, and this path took him past the foot of the bed and across the corner of the rag rug and into the narrow space between the door frame and the wall. The 5th step placed him exactly at the threshold where he would pause and reach for the door frame with his good hand and steady himself before stepping over the loud board and into the keeping room. This pause was not hesitation but preparation, a gathering of strength and balance before attempting the slight unevenness of the threshold and the different texture of the keeping room floor, which was wider planks laid in a different direction and had their own squeaks and groans and silent spots that he was still learning. The cane was the instrument that made this navigation possible, and it had become so much a part of his movement that you could not imagine him without it, even though you remembered a time when he had walked across this same floor with 2 strong legs and 2 good arms and no need for a hickory stick with a brass tip. The cane was not a crutch in the way that word was usually meant, not a sign of weakness or dependency, but a tool that extended his reach and his balance and his ability to move through a world that had been designed for bodies with 2 arms and 2 legs that worked together in easy coordination. The cane tapped ahead of him as he walked, testing the floor for obstacles that were not there because you kept the floor clear of anything that might trip him, and then it swung forward and planted itself and bore a portion of his weight, while his good leg moved to catch up. The sound of the cane on the floorboards was one of the constant sounds of the house, now like the ticking of the clock in the keeping room, and the hiss of the broth pot on the hearth and the wind in the attic window. It was a slow sound that came in irregular intervals, depending on where he was and what he was doing. A single tap when he shifted in his chair and planted the cane in a new position. A series of taps when he crossed from bed to window. A longer series when he made his way out to the keeping room to sit by the fire or stand at the kitchen door and look out at the yard. The taps were not loud enough to be disturbing, but they were present in the background of every moment, a quiet percussion that marks the passing of time in a different way than the clock, or the sunbeam, or the changing of the light. The path from the corner room to the kitchen table was the longest journey he made with any regularity, and it required 8 steps from the threshold to the chair that you had designated as his, because it was closest to the hearth and had a straight back that he could lean against without twisting. The first 4 steps crossed the keeping room in a diagonal line that avoided the bunched place in the rug, and the warped board near the hearth, and the spot where a spilled cup of water had raised the grain of the wood into a small ridge that could catch the tip of the cane if he was not careful. You watched him navigate this path many times, and you noticed that he never looked down at his feet, just kept his eyes fixed on the chair or the table or the window beyond, trusting the map in his mind to guide his steps as surely as if it were drawn on the floor in chalk. The pivot was a maneuver that he had developed to turn around in tight spaces without losing his balance or tangling the cane between his legs. It was a three-point turn executed with the slow precision of a sailing ship coming about in a narrow harbor, using the cane and the good leg and the door, jamb, or the back of a chair as the fixed points around which the rest of his body rotated. He would plant the cane firmly on the floor and shift his weight onto it, then lift his good leg and swing it around in a small arc until it pointed in the new direction. Then bring the cane around to join it and pause for a moment to re-establish his balance before continuing. The whole maneuver took perhaps 5 seconds from start to finish, and you had seen him do it hundreds of times, at the threshold of the corner room, at the kitchen table, at the front door when he stood looking out at the road, at the hearth when he turned from the fire to make his way back to his chair. The rag rug was a complication in the otherwise smooth geography of the floor, a rectangle of braided wool that lay between the bed and the window and had been there for so long that its edges had curled up slightly and its center had worn thin in the places where feet had passed most often. The rug was grey and brown and a faded indigo blue that had once been part of your best Sunday dress, and it had a tendency to bunch up near the foot of the bed where the braids had loosened and separated from one another. You had tried to flatten it many times by wetting it and weighting it down with stones, but the bunch always returned within a few days, and you had learned to live with it the way you learned to live with the crack in the plaster and the slope of the floor and the squeaky board. He learned to navigate the rug by lifting his feet slightly higher than usual and by avoiding the bunched place entirely, stepping over it or around it, depending on which direction he was traveling. The cane never caught on the rug because he lifted it clear with each step, a small extra effort that you could see in the way his shoulder rose and fell with the motion. The rug was not a danger, but it was an inconvenience, one more thing to account for in the already complicated equation of moving through the world with one arm and one good leg and a jaw that ached when he talked too long. The threshold between the corner room and the keeping room was a particular challenge, because it was not a single flat surface, but a raised oak board that sat slightly higher than the pine on either side, a board that had been installed when the house was built to separate the pantry from the main room and that now served no purpose except to trip the unwary. He had stumbled on this threshold once in the first week, catching the toe of his boot on the raised edge and lurching forward before the cane caught him and held him upright. You had seen it happen from the kitchen, and your heart had stopped for a moment and then started again when you saw that he was steady and unhurt and already adjusting his path to account for the new obstacle. After that, he always paused at the threshold and lifted his foot a little higher and set it down carefully on the other side, and you noticed that he never stumbled there again. The night journeys were different from the day journeys because the house was dark, and the map in his mind had to work without the help of his eyes. You would wake in the chair by the hearth to the sound of the bed ropes creaking, and then the soft thud of his feet on the floorboards, and then the tap of the cane as he began his slow progress across the room. You would lie still and listen to his path unfolding in the darkness, the careful avoidance of the squeaky board, the pause at the threshold, the steady rhythm of the cane on the keeping room floor as he made his way to the kitchen for a cup of water, or to the front door to look out at the road, or simply to stand by the dying fire and warm himself before returning to bed. You never rose to help him on these night journeys unless you heard something that sounded wrong, a stumble or a fall or a cry of pain that would have brought you to your feet before you were fully awake. The sounds were always the same and always followed the same pattern and always ended with the creak of the bed ropes as he lowered himself back onto the mattress and the soft exhale of breath as he settled under the quilt. These journeys were not about reaching a destination, but about moving through the darkness for its own sake, about proving to himself that he could still navigate the world even when he could not see it, about tracing the familiar paths of the floorboards as a way of reminding himself that he was still here and still moving and still capable of the small, slow acts that made up a life. The path worn into the rag rug was visible now, if you looked at it in a certain light. A dark, compressed line that ran from the edge of the bed to the window and back again, the fibers of the wall flattened and polished by the repeated passage of his bare feet and the tip of his cane. It was a subtle mark that you might not notice if you were not looking for it, just a faint darkening of the grey and brown and blue braids in a line that was no wider than your hand and no longer than the distance between two pieces of furniture. You saw it one afternoon when the sunbeam fell across the rug at a low angle and made the compressed fibers gleam dully against the softer surrounding wool, and you understood that this mark was a record of his presence in the room, a physical trace of all the hours he had spent moving between the bed and the window and back again. The geography of the house had shifted to accommodate his slow navigation, without anyone deciding that it should, just as water shifts to accommodate a stone that has fallen into a stream. The chairs in the keeping room had been moved slightly to create wider passages between them, not by any conscious plan, but by the gradual accumulation of small adjustments that you made without thinking about them. The table in the kitchen had been pushed an inch closer to the wall so that he could pass behind it, without brushing against the corner. The wood pile by the hearth had been restacked so that the best pieces were within easy reach of his chair, the ones that would catch quickly and burn hot and require the least tending. The whole house had tilted slightly toward his needs, the way the floor sloped toward the east wall, a slow, invisible accommodation that had happened over months and that no one had intended or even noticed until it was already complete. The cane left its own small marks on the floorboards in the places where he paused most often, tiny round depressions in the soft pine that caught the light when you looked at them from a certain angle. There was a cluster of these marks by the window where he stood for long periods looking out at the barn wall and the well sweep and the strip of uncut grass. There was another cluster by the hearth where he stood to warm himself on cold mornings. There was a single deep mark by the front door where he planted the cane each time he opened it to look out at the road, a mark that grew deeper by imperceptible degrees as the months passed and the seasons turned. These marks were not damage in the way that a gouge or a split would be damage, just evidence of a life being lived in a particular place in a particular way, a quiet record that would remain in the wood long after the cane had been set aside for the last time. The navigation of the board floor was not a struggle or a triumph or anything that could be named with words that implied drama or emotion. It was simply the way things were now, the slow, careful movement of a body through a space that had been learned and mapped and memorized, until it was as familiar as the feel of the quilt under his fingers or the taste of the morning porridge. The boards spoke their quiet language and he listened and responded and moved from bed to window to door and back again, and the house held him in its wooden embrace and asked for nothing in return except the small sounds of his passing, the tap of the cane and the creak of the planks and the soft scuff of his bare feet on the worn path of the rag rug. Sounds that had become as much a part of the house as the wind in the attic and the hiss of the broth and the slow turning of the seasons outside the window. The house made sounds all day and all night, and you had lived among these sounds for so many years that you no longer heard them unless something changed. A board that creaked when it should have been silent, or a wind that came from a different direction and rattled a different window. The sounds were the background of your life, like the color of the walls, and the feel of the floor under your feet, and the smell of the broth pot on the hearth, present but not noticed, constant but not noticed, constant. After he came home you began to hear the sounds again, as if for the first time, because you were listening for him, and because the quiet of the corner room had sharpened your ears in ways you had not expected. The first sound of the day was always the rooster crowing from the henhouse behind the barn, a sound that came at the same grey moment between night and morning when the sky was just beginning to lighten in the east, but the sun was still below the ridge. The rooster was old, and his crow was not the bold ringing call of a young bird, but a hoarse, cracked announcement that sounded more like a question than a statement, as if he were asking the day whether it intended to arrive or not. You heard this sound from your chair by the hearth where you often dozed in the last hours before dawn, and you would open your eyes and look toward the window and see the same grey light that you had seen on 1,000 other mornings and that never changed, no matter how many times you saw it. The second sound was the stirring of the fire in the keeping room, the soft settling of the coals as they burned down to ash, and the occasional pop of a pocket of sap or moisture trapped inside a piece of wood that had not been seasoned long enough. You would rise from your chair and cross to the hearth and add a split piece of maple or birch to the embers and watch the flame catch and spread, and then turn away to begin the morning tasks. The water for the porridge and the grinding of the coffee, if there was any coffee left in the tin, and the opening of the back door to check the barometer and feel the quality of the air. The barn door hinge was a sound that came later when the grey light had strengthened enough to see by, and you or someone else went out to milk the cow and feed the chickens and throw down hay from the loft for the horse that was no longer there. The hinge was made of iron, and it had rusted over the years into a rough orange-brown surface that grated against itself whenever the door was opened or closed. The sound was a low, grinding squeal that started high and dropped in pitch as the door swung wide, and then reversed itself and the door was pulled shut again. A sound that carried across the yard and through the closed window of the corner room and into the quiet space where he lay under the quilt, listening. You did not know if this sound bothered him or comforted him or meant nothing at all, but you heard it every morning, and you knew that he heard it too, because his ears were as sharp as yours and the sound was impossible to miss. The pump at the well made a different sound. A rhythmic creaking of the wooden handle as it was raised and lowered, and a gurgling rush of water when the bucket finally filled and the flow steadied into a splashing stream that rang against the tin sides. This sound came at various times throughout the day, depending on how much water was needed, and for what purpose, more often in the morning when the porridge pot and the broth pot and the kettle all needed filling, less often in the afternoon when the day's cooking was done and the washing had been put off until tomorrow. The sound of the pump was a sound of labor and sustenance, and the basic requirements of keeping a house and a body alive. And it joined the other sounds of the morning in a chorus that was so familiar you did not hear it unless you stopped and listened on purpose. Inside the house the sounds were smaller and closer and more intimate, the sounds of a life being lived in a small space by a small number of people who did not need to speak to communicate. The hiss of the porridge as it thickened in the pot, the soft scrape of the wooden spoon against the iron sides, the bubbling of the broth at its slow simmer, the rattle of the kettle lid when the water came to a boil, the whisper of the broom on the floorboards, the creak of the chair when you sat down, and the creak of the chair when you stood up again. These sounds filled the keeping room and the kitchen, and drifted into the corner room through the door that was always open, a hand's width, and they told him without words that you were there, and that the house was running, and that the day was proceeding in its usual slow, orderly fashion. The mouse in the wall was a sound that came only at night, when the house was still, and the fire had burned down to embers, and the only light was the faint glow of the candle through the crack in the door. The mouse lived in the space between the lath and plaster of the corner room and the exterior wall, a space that was dark and warm and protected from the weather and the cat that sometimes prowled the keeping room looking for anything that moved. You had heard the mouse on many nights over the years, a faint scratching, rustling sound that travelled along the wall behind the headboard, and then stopped, and then started again, a few feet away. It was not a loud sound, and it did not wake you, if you were already asleep. But if you were lying awake in the dark with your thoughts, it was there, like a small reminder that you were not the only living thing in the house. He heard the mouse too, and you knew this because one night when you had risen to check on him and found him sitting up in bed with his eyes open in the darkness, he said in a low voice that the mouse was back, and that it seemed to be working on something behind the plaster, near the corner. You listened and heard the scratching sound exactly where he said it would be, a soft, persistent scrabbling that might have been the mouse gathering nesting material or simply exploring the narrow passage between the walls. You stood there together in the dark listening to the mouse for several minutes, and then you went back to your chair by the hearth, and he lay down again, and the mouse continued its work undisturbed, a small, wild creature going about its business in the hidden spaces of the house while the humans rested and waited for morning. The axe in the woodlot was a sound that came from a distance and reached the corner room as a muffled thud that was felt as much as heard, a low vibration that travelled through the frozen ground and up through the foundation stones and into the floorboards. The woodlot was a quarter mile away across the south field, where the strip of uncut grass gave way to a stand of second growth, maple and birch, and the occasional oak that had been spared when the original forest was cleared. In the winter, when the ground was hard and the snow was deep enough to drag logs without tearing up the soil, you or someone else would go out with the axe and the crosscut saw and fell a tree for next year's firewood, not because the wood was needed immediately, but because the work had to be done in its season, and winter was the season for felling. The sound of the axe was a regular beat that came every few seconds, a sharp crack when the blade bit into the wood, and then a pause, and then another crack, and it went on for perhaps an hour before stopping and being replaced by the different sound of the saw, a back and forth rasping that was lower and rougher and more sustained. He would sit in his chair by the window and listen to these sounds with his head tilted slightly to one side, as if he were trying to see the woodlot through his ears. And you knew without asking that the sounds meant something to him that you could only guess at. They were the sounds of work that he had once done himself and could no longer do. The sounds of a body using tools to shape the world. The sounds of a life that continued in his absence and without his participation. The wind in the attic window was a sound that came most often in the winter when the northwest wind blew across the ridge and found the small gap between the sash and the frame where the wood had shrunk over the years and never been repaired. The sound was a low whistle that rose and fell with the gusts, sometimes barely audible and sometimes loud enough to hear from the keeping room, and it had a mournful quality that made the house feel older than it was and more exposed to the elements than it actually was. You had thought about stuffing the gap with rags or paper or a strip of old felt, but you had never done it because the sound was not unpleasant and because it served as a kind of weather vane that told you the direction and strength of the wind without having to look outside. The lamp made a sound when you turned it down at night, a soft hiss as the wick was lowered into the oil, and the flame shrank from a bright yellow tongue to a small blue bead that barely illuminated the glass chimney. This sound marked the end of the day and the beginning of the long dark hours when the house belonged to the mouse in the wall and the wind in the attic and the slow creaking of the timbers as they cooled and contracted. You would carry the lamp into the corner room and set it on the cherry table, and he would watch you turn down the wick with the same attention he gave to everything, his grey eyes following your fingers as they moved through the familiar motion. The hiss of the lamp was the last sound before silence, a small exhale that said the day was over and nothing more would be asked of anyone until morning. The page turning was a sound that occurred at irregular intervals throughout the day and evening, a soft rustle of paper that was followed by a long stretch of breathing, and then another rustle several minutes later. He had found a book in the keeping room, an old volume with a cracked leather spine and pages that had yellowed to the color of weak tea, and he had brought it into the corner room and placed it on the windowsill next to the piece of carved pine and the bean pod and the mica. The book was not a novel or a work of history or anything that required sustained attention, just a collection of agricultural reports and weather tables and almanac predictions from years that had already passed and could not be changed. He read it slowly, one page at a time, with long pauses between each page, and the sound of the paper turning was a small punctuation mark in the quiet of the room, a reminder that he was still there, and still reading, and still moving through the world at his own pace. The sounds from outside the house were different in each season, and you learned to identify them as precisely as you identified the clouds and the direction of the wind. In the spring there was the drip of melting snow from the eaves and the gurgle of water running through the downspout into the rain barrel and the distant rush of the creek at the bottom of the south field when it swelled with runoff and overflowed its banks. In the summer there was the buzz of insects in the uncut grass and the rustle of leaves when the wind moved through the maples, and the occasional distant lowing of a cow from a farm that was too far away to see. In the autumn there was the rattle of dry leaves skittering across the frozen ground, and the honking of geese passing overhead in their long V's that pointed south toward warmer places. In the winter there was the silence of snow falling and the creak of tree branches under the weight of ice, and the howl of the wind when it came from the northwest and found every gap and crack in the house's defenses. The silence between the sounds was as important as the sounds themselves, and you learned to inhabit these silences without feeling the need to fill them. The corner room was the quietest place in the house because it was the smallest and the most protected, tucked into the corner where two exterior walls met, and insulated by the plaster and the lath and the straw, tick mattress and the wall blanket and the quilt and the rug, and all the other soft things that absorbed sound rather than reflecting it. When the door was closed and the window was shut and the wind was from the south and the mouse was resting in its hidden nest, the silence in the corner room was so complete that you could hear your own heartbeat if you listened for it, and the soft rush of blood in your ears and the tiny sounds of your body going about its endless work of keeping you alive. He seemed to need this silence the way a plant needs a particular quality of light, and you gave it to him without being asked, because it was one of the few things you could give that cost nothing and meant everything. You learned to move differently when you were near his door, placing your feet more carefully on the boards and breathing more shallowly and letting the latch click into place with a sound no louder than a mouse's footfall. You learned to anticipate the sounds that might disturb him and to prevent them before they happened, oiling the hinge on the kitchen door so it would not squeak, and setting the kettle on a folded cloth so it would not rattle when it boiled, and closing the window in the keeping room before the wind could shift and make it bang against the frame. The sounds of the night were a different inventory altogether, a catalogue of small noises that you had learned to identify over years of lying awake in the dark, listening to the house settle and the world turn and the slow passage of time from midnight to dawn. The creak of the roof beams as they cooled and contracted, a sound that came from above and travelled down through the walls and into the floor, the scratch of a branch against the window when the wind blew from the east, a sound that was irregular and unpredictable and sometimes startling if you had drifted close to sleep, the distant bark of a fox from the woods beyond the south field, a sharp yipping that rose and fell and then faded into silence, the soft thud of snow sliding off the roof and landing in the yard, a sound that was felt as much as heard, and that meant the snow was heavy and wet and might need to be shoveled in the morning. His breathing was a sound that you listened for more than any other, a sound that told you he was alive and resting and not trapped in whatever dark place his mind went to when he closed his eyes. The breathing was slow and deep when he slept well, a regular rise and fall that matched the rhythm of the waves on a shore you had never seen but could imagine. The breathing was shallow and quick when he slept poorly, punctuated by small sounds that were not quite words and not quite cries but something in between. On the bad nights, you would sit in your chair by the hearth and listen to his breathing through the cracked door and wait for it to even out and deepen, and when it finally did, you would let out a breath of your own that you had not realized you were holding. The sounds of the morning came again and again and again, the same sounds in the same order, day after day and week after week and month after month. The rooster and the fire and the barn door hinge and the pump at the well and the hiss of the porridge and the bubble of the broth and the tap of the cane on the floorboards and the soft zip of the needle through leather. These sounds were a kind of music that you had not recognized as music until you stopped and listened to them all together. A slow, repetitive composition that had no climax and no resolution and no end. Just a steady unfolding that continued whether you were listening or not. The house sang its quiet song, and the corner room listened, and the man in the chair by the window added his own small notes to the chorus, the rustle of a turning page, and the whisper of a knife on pine, and the soft exhale of breath that meant he was still there, and still listening, and still moving through the slow hours of his slow recovery. The dust came from nowhere and everywhere, a fine grey powder that settled on every horizontal surface in the house, regardless of how often you wiped it away with a damp cloth or a feather brush, or the sleeve of your dress when no one was looking. It was composed of 1,000 different things that you could not see and did not want to see. The ash from the hearth, and the pollen from the uncut grass, and the dry, crumbling plaster from the walls, and the tiny fragments of wool and cotton and linen that wore away from the blanket and the quilt and the clothes you both wore, day after day. The dust was the house slowly turning back into the earth from which it had come, a process so gradual that you could only perceive it by looking away and looking back again after a long interval. The mantel in the keeping room was the place where the dust gathered most visibly, because it was dark wood against a pale wall, and because it sat at eye level where you could not help but see it every time you crossed from the kitchen to the corner room. The mantel was a simple shelf of chestnut that had been cut from a tree on this land before you were born, and planed smooth by hands that were now dust themselves, and it held a small collection of objects that had been there for so long you no longer saw them as separate things but as parts of the mantel itself. There was a tin candlestick with a stub of tallow still in it, a china cup with a hairline crack that had been glued with flour paste and never used again, a daguerreotype in a leather case that had not been opened in more than a year, and a small glass bottle that had once held vanilla extract and now held nothing but the faint sweet smell of what it had contained. The dust on the mantel accumulated in a thin, even layer that softened the edges of these objects and blurred the line between the wood and the things that rested on it. You would notice it in the morning when the light came through the east window of the keeping room at a low angle, a pale grey film that caught the sun and made the dark chestnut look as though it had been dusted with flour. You would take a damp rag from the bucket by the door and wipe the mantel clean in slow, careful strokes that moved from left to right, and lifted the dust away onto the cloth where it left a grey smear that you rinsed out in the bucket, and watched the water turn cloudy and then clear again. The mantel would be clean for perhaps 3 days, and then the dust would begin to return. First as a faint haze that you could only see if you looked closely, and then as a distinct layer that you could feel with your fingertip, and then as the same soft grey film that you had wiped away the week before. The daguerreotype case was the object that gathered the most dust because its surface was slightly recessed below a raised border, and because you never touched it and never opened it and never even looked directly at it if you could help it. The case was made of dark leather that had been embossed with a pattern of flowers and leaves, and it was closed with a small brass hook that had tarnished to a dull brown. Inside the case there was an image of a young man in a dark coat with his hair combed flat and his eyes looking directly at the camera with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite serious. The expression of someone who was trying to hold still for the long exposure and who had been told not to move and not to blink and not to breathe too deeply. The young man in the image was him before the war and before the wound and before the empty sleeve and the stiff jaw and the slow careful navigation of the board floor, and the case had not been opened since he came home, because neither of you wanted to see the difference between that face and the face that now looked out the window at the barn wall and the well sweep and the strip of uncut grass. The dust on the daguerreotype case was thicker than the dust on the rest of the mantle because you wiped around it rather than over it, lifting the cloth slightly as you passed so that the case remained undisturbed in its small circle of grey. Over the months this circle grew more distinct until he could see it from across the room, a pale ring of dust that marked the boundary between the objects you touched and the object you did not touch. The tin candlestick was clean and bright because you handled it every evening when you lit the candle and every morning when you snuffed it out. And the china cup was clean because you sometimes took it down and turned it over in your hands and thought about the day it had cracked and the way the flour paste had dried to a hard white line that you could feel with your thumbnail. The daguerreotype case remained untouched and the dust remained on it and around it, a soft grey blanket that covered the leather and the brass hook and the memory of the face inside. The cobwebs came from the spiders that lived in the high corners of every room, small brown creatures that spun their silk in places where they would not be disturbed and waited for the tiny flying things that found their way inside through the gaps in the window frames and the cracks in the plaster. The corner above the window in the keeping room was a favourite place for the spiders because the wall met the ceiling at an angle that created a deep sheltered pocket where a web could stretch from one surface to another without being torn by a passing shoulder or a swinging broom. You would notice the cobweb when the morning light caught it and made it visible, a fine grey net that sagged slightly in the middle where the spider had anchored it, and that trembled when a draught moved through the room. You would take the broom and reach up and sweep the web away with a single motion, and the spider would drop on a thread and scurry into the crack between the wall and the ceiling and begin rebuilding as soon as you turned your back. The cobwebs in the corner room were different, because you did not sweep them away unless they hung down low enough to brush against his face when he stood by the window. The corner above the bed was the highest point in the room where the ceiling sloped down to meet the east wall, and the spider had been living there for as long as you could remember, spinning its web and catching the small moths that fluttered in through the open window on summer evenings, and then dying and being replaced by another spider that looked exactly the same. The web in that corner had grown thick over the years, with layers of old silk and dust and the dried husks of insects that the spider had wrapped and stored for later, and it formed a small grey cloud that clung to the plaster and swayed gently when the wind rattled the window. He had noticed this web on his first day in the room and had looked at it for a long time and then said nothing, and you had left it there because it seemed to belong to the room in the same way that the crack in the plaster and the slope of the floor and the 3 stones on the saucer belonged to the room. The wallpaper in the corner room had been hung long before you were born by someone who had pasted it to the plaster with flour and water and smoothed it flat with a wooden roller that left faint parallel lines you could still see if the light was right. The pattern was a repeating design of small roses and green leaves on a cream background, and it had once been bright and cheerful in a way that the room had probably needed when it was first decorated. Now the roses had faded to a pale pink that was almost grey, and the leaves had faded to a brownish green that was the colour of old moss, and the cream background had yellowed to the colour of weak tea, except in one place near the window where the sun fell every afternoon, and had bleached the paper to a pale ivory. The difference between the bleached spot and the rest of the wall was subtle, but visible if you knew where to look, a rectangle of lighter color that exactly matched the shape of the sunbeam when it fell across that part of the wall in the late afternoon. The fading of the wallpaper was a process so slow that you could not see it happening even though you knew it was happening, the same way you could not see the dust accumulating or the cobwebs thickening or the floorboards wearing down under the repeated passage of feet. You would notice it only when you compared the present to a memory that was old enough to hold a different version of the room. A memory of the wallpaper when the roses were still pink enough to be called pink and the leaves were still green enough to be called green. Those memories were fading too, overwritten by the daily reality of the pale grey roses and the brownish leaves and the bleached rectangle by the window. And you could not say exactly when the change had happened, because it had happened so gradually that there was no single moment to point to and say, there, that is when the color left. The soap in the washstand dish was another measure of slow time, a bar of brown lye soap that you had made yourself from wood ash and rendered fat, and that had been drying on a rack in the toolshed for 6 months before you brought it inside and placed it in the small china dish on the cherry table. The bar was rectangular with sharp edges and a smooth surface that had been cut with a wire while the soap was still soft, and it smelled of nothing in particular except cleanliness and the faint animal scent of the fat that had gone into it. Every few days he would wet his hands and rub the bar between them, to work up a lather and then wash his face and his neck and his one good hand and the stump of his other arm as far as he could reach. And then he would rinse and dry himself with the cloth that hung from a peg by the washstand. The soap shrank by imperceptible degrees each time it was used, losing a thin layer of itself to the water and the friction and the needs of a body that required cleaning. The sharp edges softened first, rounding into gentle curves that fit more comfortably in the palm of a hand, and then the surface grew smooth and slick and slightly translucent where the water had penetrated the outer layer. The bar that had once been the size of a small block of cheese was now the size of a river stone, flat and oval and worn thin in the middle where his thumb pressed hardest when he worked up the lather. You would look at the soap every time you entered the room to empty the wash water or straighten the cloth on its peg, and you would note the size and shape and the way it sat in the dish like a small smooth pebble that had been tumbled in a stream for 1,000 years. The soap would eventually wear away to nothing, and you would replace it with another bar from the tool shed, a bar that would be sharp-edged and rectangular and full of the same faint animal scent, and the process would begin again with the softening of the corners and the rounding of the edges and the slow reduction of a useful thing to a small slick remnant that would finally dissolve completely in the water and disappear down the drain. This was the way of all things in the house, the dust and the cobwebs and the fading wallpaper and the wearing soap, a slow return to the earth from which they had come and to which they would eventually go. The windowsill in the corner room had its own accumulation of small changes that you could track if you had the patience to look closely and remember what had been there before. The collection of objects had grown since he arrived, starting with the dried bean pod and the chip of mica and the length of knotted twine, and expanding to include the piece of carved pine and the 3 smooth stones and a feather from a blue jay that had landed on the well suite one morning and left this single token behind. Each object had its own small history and its own reason for being there, and together they formed a kind of calendar that marked the passing of the months in a way that the barometer and the sunbeam and the turning pages of the almanac could not. The dust settled on these objects too, but he wiped them clean himself with the corner of his sleeve or the palm of his good hand, a small ritual that he performed every few days without being asked and without commenting. The bean pod was the easiest to clean because its surface was smooth and hard and the dust slicked off at the slightest touch, and the mica was the hardest because its surface was flaky and uneven, and the dust clung to the tiny crevices where one layer of mineral met another. The carved pine he handled more than any of the others, picking it up and turning it over and rubbing his thumb across its smooth surface until the wood grew dark and shiny from the oil of his skin, and this constant handling kept it free of dust without any need for deliberate cleaning. The floor in the corner room accumulated its own kind of dust in the form of the small debris that fell from his clothing and his blanket and his own body, the tiny threads and fibers and flakes of skin that were too small to see individually, but that together formed a fine grey film in the corners where the broom could not reach. You swept the floor every few days with a small hand broom made of broomcorn that you had grown and dried and bound yourself, and you collected the sweepings in a tin dustpan and carried them out to the ash heap behind the barn, where they joined the other remnants of the household's slow consumption of itself. The floor would be clean for a day or two, and then the film would begin to return. First as a faint haze in the corners, and then as a visible layer that you could write your name in with a fingertip. The act of sweeping was a quiet, repetitive motion that you performed without thinking about it, the broom moving in long, even strokes from the corners toward the center of the room, and then from the center toward the door, gathering the dust and the threads and the tiny fragments of nothing into a small pile that you swept onto the dustpan and carried away. The sound of the broom on the floorboards was a soft whispering that blended with the other sounds of the house, the hiss of the broth pot and the tap of the cane and the rustle of the turning page. And it was a sound that meant order was being maintained and the slow entropy of the world was being held at bay for another day. The dust on the mantel and the fading of the wallpaper and the shrinking of the soap and the accumulation of the cobwebs were not signs of neglect in the way that word was usually meant, not evidence that you had stopped caring or that the house was falling into disrepair. They were signs of a different kind of attention, an attention that was focused on the small immediate needs of a wounded body, rather than the larger, slower needs of the house itself. The porridge had to be stirred, and the broth had to be simmered, and the sleeve had to be pinned, and the cane had to be within reach. And these things mattered more than the dust on the daguerreotype case or the cobweb in the corner above the bed. The dust would still be there tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, and you would wipe it away when you had a moment, and then it would begin to return, and the cycle would continue as it had always continued, and as it would always continued, and as it would always continue. One afternoon in the late winter, when the light was grey and flat and the snow was falling in small dry flakes that hissed against the window glass, you took the damp rag and went to the mantel and wiped away the dust that had accumulated over the past week. You moved the tin candlestick and the china cup and the glass bottle, and you wiped the chestnut surface clean, and then you paused with your hand hovering over the daguerreotype case. The dust on the case was thicker than ever, a soft grey layer that obscured the embossed flowers and the tarnished brass hook, and you stood there for a long moment looking at it and thinking about the face inside, and the face in the corner room, and the distance between them, that could not be measured in miles or years or any unit you knew how to name. You did not open the case. You did not wipe away the dust. You set the damp rag down on the mantel and picked up the case and held it in both hands for a moment, feeling the weight of it and the texture of the leather and the small bump of the brass hook under your thumb. Then you carried it across the keeping room and into the corner room where he was sitting in his chair by the window, watching the snow fall on the barn wall and the well sweep and the strip of uncut grass. He turned his head when you entered, and his grey eyes went to the case in your hands and stayed there, while you crossed the room and set the case on the windowsill, among the other objects, the bean pod and the mica and the twine and the 3 stones and the blue jay feather. You did not say anything, and he did not say anything, and the case sat on the windowsill among the small collection of things that had accumulated over the months, another object with its own history and its own weight and its own claim to a place in the quiet geometry of the corner room. The dust on the case would settle there now, along with the dust on the windowsill and the dust on the floor, and the dust on the mantel that you had wiped clean an hour ago, and that was already beginning to gather again. A fine grey film that was the signature of time passing, and the house breathing, and the slow, steady accumulation of all the small things that made up a life. The light on the ridge road was the same grey quality it had been on the day the cart appeared, a soft, diffuse illumination that came from everywhere and nowhere, and made the bare branches of the maples look like charcoal lines drawn on a pale paper sky. You noticed this light when you went to the front door in the early afternoon to shake out the rag rug, and found yourself standing on the stone step, looking toward the gate without any particular reason, except that you had stood on this step at this time, on this day a year ago, and your body remembered even if your mind had not marked the date. The air was cool and still and smelled of dry leaves and wood smoke, and the faint mineral scent of the creek at the bottom of the south field, the same smells that had been present on that other afternoon, and on 1,000 afternoons before and after it. The gate latch still hung slightly askew as it had for 3 winters, and now a 4th, the wooden bar having settled into its crooked position with a permanence that suggested it would never be right again and never needed to be. The grass around the gate posts was worn thin from the passage of feet, and the turning of the cart, and the slow wearing away of the earth itself, and the bare patches had spread over the year until they formed a continuous path of packed dirt that led from the gate to the porch steps. You had watched this path develop day by day as he made his slow journeys out to the gate and back again, first just to the porch, and then to the yard, and then all the way to the gate, where he would stand with his cane planted in the dirt, and his eyes fixed on the empty road that stretched away toward the ridge. The road was empty now, as it had been on that other afternoon and on most afternoons since. A ribbon of pale dirt that curved around the stand of bare birch trees and disappeared over the rise where the cart had first appeared. You had watched him watch this road for a full year. Through the winter, when the snow covered the wheel ruts and erased all evidence of travel. Through the spring, when the mud softened and the ruts deepened and the first green things pushed up along the edges. Through the summer, when the dust rose in small clouds under the wheels of the occasional wagon that passed on its way to somewhere else. Through the autumn, when the leaves fell and the light turned grey and the road returned to its quiet, empty state, as if the year had not happened at all. He was at the gate now, standing in his usual position, with his good hand resting on the top rail and his cane leaning against the post within easy reach. You had watched him make this journey from the corner room to the gate, perhaps 100 times over the past months, first with many pauses and then with fewer, and then with none at all. The distance that had once taken him 10 minutes and required all his concentration now covered in a slow, steady walk that took perhaps 3 minutes and required no visible effort. The path he took was the same every time, out the door and across the porch and down the 3 stone steps and across the worn patch of yard to the gate, and his feet found the same places on the packed dirt that they had found on all the journeys before, wearing the path a little deeper each time witut meaning to. You hung the rug over the porch railing and beat it with the flat wooden paddle until the dust stopped rising, a task you had performed on this same day a year ago while waiting for the cart to appear. The dust that rose from the rug was grey and fine, and it drifted away on the still air and settled on the grass and the porch boards and the shoulders of your dress, the same dust that had been rising from the same rug for years, and that would continue to rise for years to come because the rug was made of wool, and wool never stopped shedding its small fibers into the air. You folded the rug into a neat rectangle and carried it inside and laid it back in its place between the bed and the window in the corner room, smoothing the edges with your hands and noting the worn path that ran across its center, a path that had deepened over the year until it was visible even in dim light. The morning routine had not changed in any way that you could measure. The porridge had been made with the same cornmeal and the same slow figure-8 stirring and the same pat of butter melting into a golden pool on top, and he had eaten it in the same small spoonfuls with the same pauses between bites to rest his jaw and look out the window at the barn wall and the well sweep and the strip of uncut grass. The window had been opened 2 inches exactly at 9 o'clock, measured with your thumb against the sash, and the cool autumn air had entered the room and stirred the smell of neatsfoot oil and brass polish and the faint human warmth of his presence. The barometer had been tapped, and the needle had held steady at a position that meant no change in the weather for at least another day, and you had recorded this in the brown paper book, along with the direction of the wind and the look of the clouds. The shaving had been done, as it was done every morning, the razor held steady while his face moved against the blade in slow, careful strokes that started at his right sideburn and travelled across his cheek and down to the hollow of his neck. The lather had been worked up in the wooden bowl with the same cake of soap that had shrunk over the year from a full round to a thin disc that you would need to replace before the winter was out. The stropping had followed with its familiar rhythm of shush and ring and shush and ring, the leather strop hooked over the door latch and drawn taut in his good hand while the blade travelled back and forth across the brown surface. The sleeve had been pinned with the same brass safety pin that you kept in the china dish on the cherry table, the fabric gathered and folded and secured just below the shoulder seam in a smooth cylinder that lay flat against his side. The broth pot bubbled on the hearth as it had bubbled every day for a year, the beef shank bones giving up their last measure of flavor to the water that had been simmering since early morning. The smell of the broth filled the keeping room and drifted into the corner room through the door that was open, a hand's width, and it mixed with the smell of the pine shavings that still lingered in the air from the piece of wood he had carved the previous week. a new piece that he had found in the scrap pile and was slowly reducing to a smooth oval that fit perfectly in his palm. The collection on the windowsill had grown to include this new piece along with the original carved pine and the bean pod and the mica and the twine and the 3 stones and the blue jay feather and the daguerreotype case that still sat where you had placed it, its leather cover still coated with a fine grey dust that you no longer tried to wipe away. The saddle sat on the floor by the window where it had been since the winter, its leather soft and supple from the months of oiling and handling, its brass fittings gleaming dully in the grey light. He had not touched it in several weeks except to run his fingers across the seat when he passed on his way to the window, a small gesture that seemed to be more about the texture of the leather than any intention to use it. The tack and harness that he had mended over the winter hung from their pegs in the barn, returned to their places and waiting for a horse that would probably never come, and a rider who would probably never sit them again, but the waiting did not seem to trouble them, and the mending had been its own reward. The afternoon passed in the same slow way that all afternoons passed in the corner room, measured by the movement of the sunbeam across the rag rug, and the turning of pages in the almanac, and the soft zip of the needle through leather when he felt like mending something that did not need mending. You went about your tasks in the keeping room and the kitchen and the yard, the same tasks you had performed on this day a year ago and on all the days between, drawing water from the well and adding wood to the fire, and checking the barometer and stirring the broth and carrying cups of warm liquid to the corner room where he received them with a small nod and drank them in slow, careful sips. The light began to soften toward evening around 4 o'clock as it always did at this time of year, the grey sky darkening by imperceptible degrees until the whitewashed walls of the corner room glowed with a gentle warmth that seemed to come from within rather than without. You went to the window and closed it the way you closed it every afternoon at this time, lowering the sash until the gap was gone, the cool air was shut out, and the warmth of the room was trapped inside for the night. He watched you do this from his chair with his cane across his knees and his grey eyes following your hands as they moved through the familiar motion. And when the window was closed, he turned his head back to the glass and looked out at the barn wall and the well sweep and the strip of uncut grass that were fading into the deepening twilight. The lamp was lit at the usual hour when the darkness had advanced far enough that you could no longer see the stitches in the leather or the grain in the carved pine or the expression in his eyes when he looked at you. You carried the lamp into the corner room and set it on the cherry table and adjusted the wick until the flame burned steady and yellow and the shadows retreated to the corners where they belonged. The light fell on his face and on the empty sleeve pinned at his shoulder and on the cane leaning against the arm of the chair and on the saddle on the floor and on the collection of small objects on the windowsill, and everything looked exactly as it had looked on 100 other evenings and would look on 100 other evenings to come. The sound of the thread pulling through leather began again as it often did in the evening, a soft zipping noise that repeated every few seconds and blended with the hiss of the lamp and the pop of the fire in the keeping room and the distant scratch of the mouse in the wall behind the headboard. He was mending a rein that had worn thin where it rubbed against the bit, a rein that he had mended once before in the winter and that had held through the spring and summer and was now showing signs of wear again. The needle moved through the punched holes with the same slow rhythm it had always moved, and the waxed thread followed behind and pulled the edges of the leather together and held them fast. The work would take as long as it took, and no longer, and when it was finished, he would set the rein aside and pick up another piece of tack that needed attention and begin again. You sat in the keeping room with your own small tasks, the darning of a sock that had worn thin at the heel, and the sorting of the beans that had been spread on a cloth to dry, and the recording of the day's weather in the brown paper book. The fire burned low and you added a piece of maple, and watched the flame catch and spread, and then returned to your work while the house settled into its nighttime rhythm. The wind had shifted to the northwest, and you could hear it beginning to find the gap in the attic window, a low whistle that rose and fell with the gusts, and it would continue through the night and into the morning. The mouse was scratching in the wall, and the thread was zipping through the leather, and the lamp was hissing softly on the cherry table, and all of these sounds together formed a quiet music that you had heard so many times it had become the sound of peace itself. The gate stood empty in the darkness at the end of the worn path, its wooden latch still hanging askew, and its posts still sunk deep in the earth where they had been planted before you were born. The road beyond the gate was invisible now, swallowed by the night and the distance and the curve of the ridge, but you knew it was there because it had always been there and would always be there, whether you could see it or not. The cart had come down that road a year ago, and the cart had gone away again, and the road had returned to its quiet, empty state, and nothing had changed, and everything had changed, and everything had changed in ways that were too small to name. He knew the weight of the water bucket now without having to lift it, could tell by the way you carried it across the keeping room whether it was full or half full or nearly empty and needed to be refilled at the well. This knowledge had come to him over the course of the year, through the patient accumulation of small observations, the sound of the water sloshing against the tin sides and the angle of your arm as you balanced the weight and the number of steps it took you to cross from the door to the hearth. He knew the exact moment when the porridge was ready by the change in the smell that drifted from the kitchen, a subtle shift from raw cornmeal to cooked grain that happened in the space of a few minutes and that told him breakfast would arrive soon. He knew the direction of the wind by the sound it made in the attic window and the temperature of the floorboards under his bare feet and the way the candle flame danced or held steady in the draught. He could stand at the gate for 10 minutes now without fatigue, his good hand resting on the top rail and his cane planted in the dirt beside him, his eyes fixed on the empty road that led away toward the ridge. You had watched him do this many times over the past months, first for only a minute or two before his leg began to ache and he had to turn back toward the house, then for longer and longer intervals as his strength returned by increments too small to measure. The 10 minutes had been reached sometime in the late summer when the grass was high and the insects buzzed in the uncut field, and the road was dusty and pale under the hot sun, and he had stood there for exactly 10 minutes by the clock on the mantel, and then turned and walked back to the house with the same slow, steady pace he had used on the way out. The evening deepened into night, and the lamp burned on the cherry table, and the thread continued to pull through the leather with its soft, repetitive sound. You finished the darning and set the sock aside and put the beans into a cloth bag and hung it from a peg in the pantry where the mice could not reach it. The fire had burned down to embers and you added one more piece of wood, a small piece of birch that would burn for an hour, and then fade and leave the keeping room in darkness until morning. You sat in your chair by the hearth and listened to the sounds of the house, and the sounds of the corner room and the distant sound of the wind in the attic, and you felt the weight of the year that had passed settle over you like a second blanket, warm and familiar and not at all uncomfortable. The circle of the seasons had returned to the gate and found it unchanged except for the worn path that led to it, and the man who stood there now without fatigue and looked out at the empty road with the patience of someone who had learned to wait without waiting for anything in particular. The maple leaves had turned the same color of rust and old leather, and they hung in the same still air, and some of them had already fallen and lay in the same dry brown carpet across the same wheel ruts that cut through the grass. The light was the same grey, and the smells were the same, and the sounds were the same, and nothing had happened that could be called an event or a milestone or a turning point in the story of his recovery. The thread pulled through the leather, and the lamp hissed on the table, and the mouse scratched in the wall, and the wind whistled in the attic, and the house held them both in its wooden embrace, and asked for nothing more than what they had already given, which was their presence, and their patience and their willingness to continue through the slow, unremarkable days that added up to a life. The road remained empty, and the gate remained crooked, and the barometer needle held steady on the wall by the back door. And this stillness was not the absence of something, but the presence of everything that mattered. A quiet resolution that needed no words and no acknowledgement and no witness beyond the two people who inhabited it together in the small corner room and the keeping room and the worn path between them. The lamp would burn for another hour, and then you would rise and go to the corner room and turn down the wick, and watch the flame shrink to a small blue bead that barely illuminated the glass chimney. He would set aside the rein and the needle and the waxed thread, and he would rise from his chair with the help of the cane and make his slow way to the bed, where he would sit on the edge and wait for you to help him with the sleeve and the buttons and the other small necessities of the evening routine. You would perform these tasks with the same quiet attention you had given them on 100 other evenings, and then you would pull the quilt up to his chin and take the lamp and go back to the keeping room, where your chair waited by the dying fire. The house would settle into its nighttime silence, broken only by the wind and the mouse and the small creaks of the timbers cooling in the dark, and you would sit in your chair and listen for his breathing through the cracked door and wait for it to even out and deepen into the rhythm of sleep. The breathing would come and the breathing would go, and the night would pass in its slow measure, and the grey light would return to the east window, and the rooster would crow his hoarse, cracked question, and the day would begin again, the same as the day before, and the same as the day after, and the same as all the days that stretched ahead in an unbroken line toward a horizon that neither of you needed to see or name or hurry toward. The quiet year after war had ended, not with a bang or a whimper or any sound at all, but with the simple recognition that it had never really been a year with a beginning and an end, just a continuation of the same slow turning that had always been and would always be, the seasons circling the gate and the dust settling on the mantel, and the thread pulling through the leather, and the road remaining empty, and the house remaining still, and the two of you remaining together in the quiet geometry of the corner room where everything that mattered was already present and at hand prepared.